I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe because saying it out loud to anyone feels impossible, or maybe because I need to see it all laid out in front of me to understand what actually happened. Either way, I keep thinking that if I don't tell someone, even if it's just words on a screen, then I'm going to lose my mind trying to make sense of it alone. This started about 14 months ago, during a particularly bleak period in my life. I was living in Leeds, working as a pharmacy assistant, which sounds more important than it actually was. Mostly, I just counted tablets and dealt with people collecting prescriptions. The pay was terrible. I'd recently ended a long-term relationship, and I was spending most of my free time alone in my bedsit feeling sorry for myself. Not a great place to be mentally, but not unusual either. Plenty of people go through rough patches. One evening, after a particularly tedious shift, where the automated system had gone down and we'd had to process everything manually, I came home and did what I usually did. Made some toast, opened my laptop, and started browsing mindlessly. I'd been reading about internet privacy, data collection, that sort of thing. The kind of articles that make you realize how much of your personal information is floating around out there. It's unsettling when you really think about it. That led me down a rabbit hole about anonymity online, which eventually led to articles about the dark web. I'd heard of it, obviously. Everyone has. But I'd always assumed it was either inaccessible to ordinary people or exclusively used for illegal purposes. The articles I read suggested otherwise. Apparently, a lot of it was just people wanting privacy. Activists in repressive countries, journalists protecting their sources, whistleblowers. Normal people who didn't want corporations tracking their every click. Getting access turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. I'm not particularly technical, but I managed it in maybe 15 minutes. And suddenly, there I was, browsing this entirely different version of the internet. Most of it was disappointing, honestly. Broken links, sites that wouldn't load, pages that looked like they'd been designed in 1995. I spent an hour clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting or shocking. Then I found something called the Volunteer Program. It was linked from one of those directory sites that list various dark web services. The description was minimal. Connect with people who need help. Make a real difference. There was a simple web address underneath. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but professional looking. White background, black text, a logo at the top showing two hands clasped together. The homepage explained what the program was about. Essentially, it was a platform connecting volunteers with people who needed assistance but couldn't access traditional help channels. People in difficult situations. People who couldn't go to authorities or official organizations for various reasons. The site emphasized that everything was confidential and anonymous, designed to protect both volunteers and the people seeking help. It all sounded quite noble, actually. There was a section explaining the kinds of help people might need. Someone to talk to during a crisis, assistance locating resources, help navigating difficult personal situations, support for people escaping dangerous circumstances. The site stressed that volunteers were never asked to do anything illegal or put themselves at risk. It was purely about offering guidance, emotional support, and practical advice to people who had nowhere else to turn. There was a button at the bottom, register as a volunteer. I clicked it without thinking too much about it. The form that appeared asked for basic information: age, general location, languages spoken, areas where I might be able to help. There were options to select: emotional support, practical advice, resource guidance, local knowledge. I ticked a few boxes. Emotional support seemed doable. I could listen to people. And local knowledge, since I'd lived in Leeds for several years, and knew the area reasonably well. The form asked for an anonymous contact method. I created a temporary email address and submitted the form. The confirmation page said someone would review my application and be in touch within a few days if I was accepted. I closed the browser and didn't think much more about it. It had been a momentary impulse, filling out a form on a random website. I didn't really expect anything to come of it. 4 days later, I checked the temporary email account and found a message waiting. The subject line said, "Volunteer application approved." The message welcomed me to the program and explained how it worked. When someone needed help, they would submit a request through the platform describing their situation. The system would match them with appropriate volunteers based on location and expertise. If I was selected for a request, I'd receive an email with details and could choose whether to accept or decline. Everything was anonymous. I'd never know the real identity of the person I was helping, and they'd never know mine. It seemed straightforward enough. At the end of the email was a link to the volunteer dashboard where I could view any requests assigned to me. I clicked through. The dashboard was empty except for a welcome message and some basic statistics. Apparently, there were around 300 active volunteers and roughly twice that many people seeking help at any given time. The site had been running for several years and had facilitated thousands of successful connections. I left it at that. Checked the dashboard every few days, but there were never any requests assigned to me. I started to forget about it. Then, about 3 weeks after I'd registered, an email arrived. The subject line said, "New request assigned, action required." The message explained that someone in the Leeds area had submitted a request for help, and I'd been matched based on my location and indicated areas of support. The person's situation was described briefly. They were trying to leave a difficult living arrangement, but didn't have access to traditional support services. They needed advice about local resources and someone to talk to who understood the area. There was a link to a secure messaging system where I could communicate with them if I chose to accept the request. The email stressed that I could decline at any time, for any reason, with no explanation required. I clicked through to the messaging system. There was one message waiting, sent from an anonymous account identified only as Request 247. The message was longer than I'd expected. It explained that the person was living with a family member who had become increasingly controlling and aggressive. They wanted to move out, but didn't have much money or anywhere to go. They couldn't go to the council or social services because of complicated family circumstances they didn't want to explain. They just needed someone to talk to who knew Leeds, who might be able to suggest places to stay or organizations that could help without asking too many questions. The tone was desperate, but not melodramatic. Just someone in a bad situation, looking for practical help. I wrote back, said I was sorry they were going through this and that I tried to help however I could. I asked a few questions about what kind of accommodation they were looking for and whether they had any income. Basic things that would help me point them in the right direction. The response came within a few hours. They answered my questions, provided more details about their situation. They couldn't afford much rent. They needed somewhere short-term, just until they could get themselves sorted. They'd been looking at rooms in shared houses, but most required deposits they didn't have. Over the next few days, we exchanged several messages. I suggested a few hostels and shelters I knew about. Gave them information about local charities that help people in housing crises. I looked up details about housing benefit and how to apply. I tried to be helpful without being pushy or overwhelming. They seemed grateful. Said I was the first person who'd actually listened and tried to help, rather than just telling them what they should do. That felt good, honestly. I was going through my own rough time, feeling fairly useless, and here was something I could actually do that made a difference. After about a week of messages back and forth, they said they'd found a room. Someone was letting them stay temporarily while they sorted out something more permanent. They thanked me repeatedly, said they couldn't have managed without the information I provided. I felt genuinely pleased. It was a small thing really, just answering some questions and pointing someone toward resources, but it had helped. They were safe, or safer at least, and I'd played a small part in that. The messaging system showed the request as completed. A few days later, I received an email from the volunteer program thanking me for my assistance and asking if I'd be willing to accept future requests. I said yes. The second request came about 2 weeks later. Different person, different situation. Someone who was being harassed by an ex-partner and didn't want to involve the police. They needed advice about staying safe, about what to do if the harassment escalated. I provided what information I could, suggested some local organizations that specialized in domestic abuse support, even though they insisted it hadn't reached that level yet. That one resolved fairly quickly too. They said the harassment had stopped after they'd followed some of the safety advice I'd given them. The third request arrived a month after that. This time, it was someone who needed help finding a specific type of support service in Leeds, something to do with mental health. Though they were vague about the details, I did some research, found a few options, passed the information along. They seemed satisfied. I started to feel like I was actually good at this, like I'd found something worthwhile to do with my evenings beyond sitting alone, feeling miserable. The requests kept coming, maybe one every couple of weeks. All different situations, all different people, but all following roughly the same pattern. Someone in trouble, needing local knowledge or a sympathetic ear, and me providing what help I could. Then I got a request that felt different from the start. The initial message was brief and oddly formal. It said the person needed help with what they called a sensitive observation matter. They needed someone in Leeds to visit a specific location and report back on what they saw. Nothing illegal, they stressed. They just needed an independent observer to confirm some information for them. I wrote back asking for more details. What location? What kind of information? The response came quickly. They provided an address in Headingley, not far from where I lived, a residential street. They said they needed someone to go to that address at a specific time, observe the property for maybe half an hour, and report back on any activity they saw. Were the lights on? Were there cars in the driveway? Did anyone come or go? I asked why they needed this information. The response was vague. They said they were trying to verify someone's living situation for personal reasons, but couldn't visit the location themselves. They assured me it wasn't anything sinister, just a matter of confirming some details. It felt odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe it was someone checking up on a property they owned, or trying to find out if a relative was actually living where they claimed to be. There were plenty of innocent explanations. I agreed to do it. The address was only a 10-minute walk from my flat. I could go one evening after work, spend half an hour sitting on a bench or walking around the area, see what I saw, and report back. Simple enough. I went the following evening, around 7 o'clock. The address was a terraced house on a quiet street. Lights were on inside. There was a car in the driveway, a dark blue Vauxhall. I walked past a few times casually, like I was just someone out for an evening stroll. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement through them occasionally. Someone was definitely home. After about 40 minutes, I left and went home. Sent a message through the system describing what I'd seen. Lights on, car present, signs of occupancy. The response came within minutes. They thanked me and asked if I'd be willing to do the same thing again in a few days, at a different time. They wanted to establish a pattern. That's when I should have said no. But I didn't. I'd already done it once, and nothing bad had happened. It was just observation, just reporting factual information. So I agreed. I went back 3 more times over the following week. Different times of day, morning, afternoon, evening. Each time I sent back a brief report. Car present or not present. Lights on or off. People coming or going. Basic observations. After the 4th visit, they said they had everything they needed and thanked me for my help. The request was marked as completed. The next request came a week later. Different person, but similar task. Another address, this time in Kirkstall. Same basic assignment, observe and report. I did it without questioning. Then another request, another address, another observation. I started to realize that most of my requests now were these observation tasks. The other kind, the ones where people needed emotional support or practical advice, had mostly stopped coming. Now it was almost exclusively these surveillance requests. I should have stopped accepting them, but by that point, I'd done maybe 10 or 12 of them, and nothing bad had ever come of it. Nobody had ever confronted me. The police had never shown up. As far as I could tell, I was just collecting information that could have been gathered by anyone walking down a public street. Then I got a request that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The address they gave me was on my own street, 4 doors down from my building. The message said they needed the usual information: observation of the property, activity reports, times when people were present or absent. But it was so close to where I lived. I walked past that house every day. The person making the request would have known that when they assigned it to me. They would have known my general location from my volunteer profile. I wrote back asking why they needed this information. The response was the same vague explanation I'd received before. Personal verification, nothing illegal, just needed an independent observer. I almost declined, but I'd accepted so many of these requests already. What was one more? And it was on my own street. I didn't even need to go out of my way. So I did it. Watched the house for a few days, sent back my reports. The request was completed without incident, but something about it stayed with me. Made me think about all the other observations I'd done, all those addresses, all those reports about when people were home and when they weren't, about their routines and patterns. I went back through my message history, counted up all the observation requests I'd completed. There were more than 20 different addresses across Leeds, 20 different properties I'd surveilled and reported on. I started wondering what the information was being used for. Personal verification, they'd always said. But verification of what? And why did it require multiple observations at different times? Why did it need to be done anonymously through a dark web platform, rather than through any official channel? I tried to tell myself it was fine, that I was overthinking it, that there were legitimate reasons someone might need this kind of information. But the unease wouldn't go away. I stopped accepting observation requests. When they came through, I declined them without explanation. For a while, that seemed to work. I'd get the occasional request, decline it, and nothing would happen. Then I started noticing things, small things at first. My post seemed to arrive later than usual, like someone was checking it before it reached my door. I'd find my bin moved slightly, as though someone had been looking through it. Once, I came home to find my front door unlocked. even though I was certain I'd locked it that morning. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of everything was getting to me, that there were innocent explanations for all of it. Then I checked my volunteer dashboard and saw something that made my blood run cold. My profile had been updated. There was a new section I'd never seen before. Services provided. It listed all the observation requests I'd completed. But not just the addresses. It included photographs of the houses I'd watched, of the streets, of the cars in driveways, of people entering and leaving properties. I hadn't taken any photographs. I'd just observed and reported. But someone else had. Someone had been following me, documenting my surveillance work, taking pictures while I stood there watching houses. And those photographs were now attached to my profile, visible to anyone using the platform. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available anymore. I sent a message to the platform administrators demanding they remove my profile. No response came. I stopped checking the dashboard, stopped looking at the messages, but the emails kept coming. New requests being assigned, observation tasks, all in Leeds, all near my home. Then the photographs started appearing in my post, printed out and slipped into my letterbox. Pictures of me standing on various streets, watching various houses. Pictures I hadn't known were being taken. Each one had a date and timestamp. Each one showed me doing exactly what I'd been asked to do. There was never a note with them. Never any explanation, just the photographs. I went to the police, told them someone was following me, taking pictures of me. They asked if I knew who it was or why. I said no. I couldn't tell them about the volunteer program or the observation requests. How could I explain that without implicating myself in something that sounded, in hindsight, very much like stalking? They said they'd keep a record of my report, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I be vigilant, maybe install a camera outside my flat. I couldn't afford a camera. I could barely afford rent. The photographs kept coming, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Always pictures of me doing observation work. Always stamped with dates and times that proved exactly when and where I'd been. Then one arrived that was different. It showed me walking home from work, not doing any observation task, just walking down my usual route. The date stamp was from the previous day. They were still following me, still documenting my movements, even though I'd stopped accepting requests. I checked the dashboard one more time. My profile now listed me as temporarily unavailable, but still showed all the completed requests, all the photographs. And there was a new section, current location tracking. Underneath was a map, showing my movements over the past few weeks, my route to work, the shops I visited, the pub where I occasionally met friends, all of it plotted out in detail. I don't know how they were tracking me. My phone, probably. Or maybe they were just following me physically. Maybe it was both. I moved out of my bedsit 2 weeks later, found a new place in a different part of Leeds, didn't tell anyone where I was going except my employer, changed my phone number, deleted all my email accounts, and started fresh. For a few months, everything seemed fine. No more photographs, no more strange incidents. I started to relax, to think maybe I'd managed to escape it. Then a new request appeared. I don't know how it found me because I deleted everything, but somehow it did. An email to my new address from the volunteer program, subject line, outstanding request, urgent. The message said I had one final observation task to complete, an address in my new neighborhood, a property 3 streets away from where I now lived. They'd found me again. I haven't accepted the request, but I haven't declined it either. It just sits there in my inbox, waiting. And every few days, another email arrives. A reminder that the request is still pending, that I'm expected to complete it. I don't know what happens if I refuse. I don't know if they'll escalate, if more photographs will arrive, if they'll do something worse. I've started seeing the same people around my new neighborhood, different people than before, but they're always there, standing on corners, sitting in parked cars, looking at their phones. Maybe they're just ordinary people going about their business. Maybe I'm paranoid now, seeing threats everywhere. Or maybe they're volunteers too. Maybe the whole thing works like this. You help them with one thing, then another, until you've helped so much that you can't stop, until they have so much information about you, so many photographs, so much documentation of your activities, that refusing becomes impossible. I don't go out much anymore. Work and back, that's it. I keep my curtains drawn. I check my post immediately when it arrives. I've covered the camera on my laptop with tape. The request is still sitting in my inbox, still waiting. And I know that eventually I'm going to have to make a decision. Accept it and hope that completing one more task will finally be enough. Or refuse it and find out what they do to volunteers who stop cooperating. Either way, I don't think this ends well for me. I was stupid, naive. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was doing something good. But I wasn't helping anyone. I was working for them, gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance, and now I'm trapped in it with no clear way out. So that's why I'm writing this down. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear or if something worse occurs, at least there will be some record of how it started. Some explanation of why a pharmacy assistant from Leeds ended up involved in whatever this actually is. I wanted to help people. That's all it was supposed to be. But I've learned something these past few months. When someone offers you the chance to help anonymously, with no questions asked and no accountability, you should ask yourself who's really being helped, and more importantly, who's being used. The whole thing started because I was bored. That sounds trivial, almost embarrassingly so, but it's the truth. 6 months of unemployment after a decade at the same marketing firm had left me restless. Days blurred together in my small apartment. Job applications vanished into the digital void. My savings dwindled. The monotony became almost physically painful, a constant dull pressure behind my eyes. I've never been particularly tech-savvy. I use social media, stream movies, shop online, the usual things. But one night, scrolling through an obscure forum discussing internet privacy, I saw a comment that caught my attention. Someone mentioned how easy it was to access what they called the hidden web, using certain browsers and protocols. They described communities and content unavailable through standard search engines. The way they wrote about it made it sound like an exclusive club, a digital speakeasy hiding in plain sight. Maybe it was the isolation talking, or just the human desire to access spaces marked forbidden. But I decided to explore. I installed the specialized browser, followed basic tutorials, and found myself navigating a parallel internet, slower, less polished, but intriguing in its obscurity. Most sites were underwhelming. Text-heavy forums discussing privacy rights, cryptocurrency exchanges, marketplaces for things I had no interest in purchasing. Nothing particularly shocking or compelling. After a week of casual browsing, I stumbled across a forum dedicated to what users called immersive experiences. The discussion revolved around live streams of various scenarios, some mundane, others more extreme. Members debated the authenticity of different streams, sharing technical criteria for distinguishing staged content from genuine footage. Many contributors seemed to be chasing something they called the real thing, dismissing most available streams as elaborate fiction designed to separate viewers from their cryptocurrency. One username appeared consistently in these discussions: Veritas Proxy. Unlike other members who argued passionately about which streams were authentic, Veritas Proxy maintained an analytical detachment, discussing viewer psychology more than content authenticity. They wrote about how the perception of reality affected viewer engagement, regardless of whether the content was staged. Their posts read like academic research rather than entertainment reviews. After observing silently for several days, I sent Veritas Proxy a private message, expressing curiosity about these immersive experiences they analyze so clinically. I expected to be ignored, or perhaps dismissed as a novice. Instead, I received a detailed response explaining different categories of live streams available through anonymous networks. Most were indeed staged productions masquerading as authentic footage, Veritas Proxy explained, but they still satisfied a psychological need for viewers to feel they were accessing something forbidden, something real. We exchanged several messages discussing the appeal of these experiences. I found myself drawn into conversation with this stranger, perhaps because they engaged with me more meaningfully than anyone had in months. When Veritas Proxy offered to show me what they considered a genuinely immersive stream, something beyond the amateur productions flooding anonymous platforms, I accepted without much hesitation. They sent coordinates, not a web address in the traditional sense, but a string of characters and numbers that meant nothing to me. Veritas Proxy included instructions for accessing a platform called the Observatory at a specific time that night. The stream would begin at precisely 2 a.m., they explained, and first-time viewers were granted limited access without payment. If I found the experience valuable, future viewings would require cryptocurrency contributions. That night, I followed the instructions precisely, navigating through several layers of security to reach a minimalist page with a black background and simple interface. A countdown timer showed 17 minutes until the stream would begin. A small counter in the corner indicated 26 current viewers. No chat function, no user list, no indication of what I was about to watch. At exactly 2 a.m., the screen changed. The video showed an ordinary bedroom, unmade bed, dresser with cluttered surface, clothes draped over a chair. Nothing unusual or particularly interesting. The camera angle suggested it was positioned high in one corner of the room, like a security camera. For several minutes, nothing happened. The room remained empty, the only movement coming from a ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. Just as my attention began to wander, a person entered the frame. They moved normally, unaware of being observed, performing routine actions, checking their phone, sorting through items on the dresser, sitting on the edge of the bed. The mundanity was almost disappointing after the elaborate security measures required to access the stream. A small panel appeared beside the video, displaying what seemed to be biometric data: heart rate, respiration, body temperature, though I couldn't tell if it was from the subject or aggregated from viewers. Below this panel was a series of options labeled ambient adjustments, with controls for room temperature, lighting, and sound systems. At the 20-minute mark, a notification appeared. Observation phase complete. Interaction phase authorized for premium viewers. The ambient controls became active, no longer grayed out. In the viewer count, several numbers changed from white to green, presumably indicating premium status. Almost immediately, the room's lighting dimmed slightly. The person in the frame looked up, momentarily confused by the change. Over the next 10 minutes, I watched as various ambient adjustments were implemented. The temperature display showed a drop of several degrees. A faint sound began playing through what must have been hidden speakers in the room. The subject's confusion turned to visible unease. They checked their phone, examined the air vent, looked around for the source of the sound. A new option appeared for premium viewers, proximity alert. Seconds after this became active, a noise came from somewhere outside the camera's view, perhaps the hallway or another room. The subject's heart rate, displayed in the data panel, increased significantly. They moved to the bedroom door, listened for a moment, then closed and locked it. The escalation continued gradually. More ambient adjustments, more unexplained sounds, each causing increased distress visible in both the subject's behavior and the biometric data. The person tried calling someone on their phone, but the call appeared not to connect. They checked the windows, confirmed the door lock, searched the room as if looking for an explanation for the strange occurrences. Throughout all of this, I remained a passive observer. My viewer status showed as basic/first time, with all interactive elements unavailable to me. I could only watch as others manipulated the environment, steadily increasing the subject's anxiety. There was something disturbingly methodical about the process, like a scientific protocol rather than random harassment. At the 1-hour mark, a final notification appeared. Culmination phase authorized for executive viewers only. The viewer numbers shifted again, most green numbers returning to white, leaving only 3 in green. A new set of controls appeared, though I couldn't see what options they contained from my access level. What happened next occurred so smoothly it seemed rehearsed, though the subject's genuine terror suggested otherwise. A barely perceptible gas began filling the room, visible only as slight distortion in the air. The subject noticed it too late, first becoming disoriented, then struggling to remain conscious. Before losing awareness completely, they managed to reach the door, finding it somehow impossible to unlock despite their earlier precautions. The biometric display showed decreasing heart rate and respiration as the subject collapsed near the door. The stream continued for another 30 minutes, showing the empty room and the unconscious person. A cursor occasionally appeared on screen as someone adjusted the camera angle for better views. The 3 executive viewers remained connected throughout. At the 2-hour mark, 2 figures entered the room wearing simple hazmat-style protection. They efficiently moved the unconscious subject onto a stretcher and out of the camera's view. One returned momentarily to straighten the room, removing any evidence of disturbance before the stream finally ended. A message appeared on my screen. Observation complete. Your viewing patterns have been analyzed. Premium access recommendations will be provided based on your engagement metrics. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I had witnessed. Had I just watched a real person being abducted? Was this an elaborate performance with paid actors? The production seemed too sophisticated for amateur staging, but too risky to be an actual crime broadcast live. I closed the browser and shut down my computer, suddenly aware of how vulnerable my own apartment felt. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been staged, an immersive theater experience designed to seem authentic. The alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. I decided not to access the observatory again, regardless of any premium recommendations I might receive. 3 days later, an email arrived in my personal account, an account I had never used when installing the specialized browser or communicating with Veritas Proxy. The subject line read, Viewing analysis complete. The message contained a detailed assessment of my engagement patterns during the stream. Which moments had captured my attention longest, where my cursor had hovered on screen, even estimations of my emotional responses based on my viewing behavior. The analysis concluded that I fit the profile of an empathic observer, someone who experienced heightened engagement from witnessing genuine distress, but remained morally conflicted about it. The email ended with coordinates for another stream scheduled for the following night, this time requiring a cryptocurrency payment for access. I deleted the email immediately and ran security scans on all my devices. Finding nothing unusual, I still found myself checking my apartment for hidden cameras, suddenly aware of how my bedroom window faced another building, how my computer's webcam light could be disabled, how the smart devices in my home were always listening. A week passed without further contact. I began to relax, telling myself the entire experience had been nothing more than an elaborate scam targeting cryptocurrency from gullible viewers. Then a package arrived at my door. No shipping label, no indication of how it had been delivered. Inside was a small electronic device resembling a key fob, with a single button and tiny LED display, currently showing the number 37. No note accompanied the device, but I didn't need one to understand its purpose. I was being invited to move from observer to participant, from audience to contributor. The number 37 likely indicated currently connected viewers. The button, presumably, would activate something affecting someone else's environment. Someone currently sitting in their home, experiencing inexplicable events orchestrated by strangers they would never see. I considered reporting everything to authorities, but what evidence did I have? An anonymous website I could no longer access. An email I had deleted, a mysterious device with no identifying features, and my own participation as a willing observer of what might have been a serious crime. That was 2 weeks ago. I've since moved to a different apartment, changed my email addresses, replaced my electronic devices. The key fob device remains in a drawer, untouched. Sometimes at night, I check to see if the number has changed. It has, increasing steadily from 37 to 63 as of yesterday. More observers joining the network. More participants receiving their own devices. More subjects being selected for immersive experiences. Last night, returning home late, I noticed a small red light blinking in the corner of my new bedroom, exactly where a security camera might be positioned for optimal coverage. When I investigated, I found nothing. No device, no explanation for the light I was certain I had seen. This morning, my laptop displayed a notification I never set up. Observation begins tonight, 2 a.m. Current viewer count, 26. I won't be in my apartment at 2 a.m. I won't be using any electronic devices, accessing any networks, or leaving any digital footprint that could be traced. But I can't escape the thought that somewhere, someone is adjusting their ambient controls, preparing their culmination protocols, waiting to transform another person's ordinary night into content for unseen observers. And I can't forget that I was one of those observers once, that my viewed became viewer metrics, that my engagement was measured and categorized, that my curiosity opened a door I now cannot seem to close. We think of horror as something external, something that happens to other people in distant places. We don't consider how our observation itself creates demand, how our attention forms the marketplace where others' fear becomes commodity. The real terror isn't what happens in those rooms. It's that somewhere right now, someone is watching, analyzing, anticipating your reactions, not to help or protect, but to measure how effectively your fear can entertain. I moved to Seoul 3 years ago to teach English at a private academy. The transition from my small Midwestern hometown to one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world was jarring in ways I hadn't anticipated. The crowded subway stations, the constant digital advertisements on every surface, the blinding speed of the internet, all of it overwhelmed me initially. But humans adapt. After 6 months, I barely noticed these things anymore. What I did notice was my growing sense of isolation. Despite being surrounded by millions of people, my limited Korean and cultural differences created invisible barriers. Most of my social interactions were with other foreign teachers who came and went as their contracts ended. The few Korean friends I made were busy with demanding jobs and family obligations. Gradually, my world narrowed to my small apartment, the academy where I taught, and the convenience store on the corner. I'm telling you this to explain why I spend so much time online. In a city where I often felt invisible, the internet offered connection. I joined forums for expatriates, video chatted with family back home, and participated in online gaming communities. My laptop became my primary window to human interaction beyond the superficial conversations at work. My apartment came with the fastest internet connection I'd ever experienced, a common feature in Seoul, where digital infrastructure is prioritized. Downloads that would have taken hours back home completed in seconds. Video calls never lagged. Streaming was instantaneous. This remarkable connectivity became something I took for granted until the night it inexplicably faltered. It started with minor disruptions, buffering videos, delayed messages, dropped calls. Frustrating but not unusual, even in Seoul. I ran speed tests showing significantly reduced bandwidth. Thinking it might be a building-wide issue, I messaged my neighbor, another English teacher, who often helped me navigate these small annoyances of expatriate life. He reported no problems with his connection. I contacted my internet provider, navigating their automated customer service system with my limited Korean. After several redirections, I received a message that a technician would check the external connections to my building the following day. Until then, I would have to manage with the degraded service. That night, trying to video chat with my sister, the connection became so poor that her image froze repeatedly, her voice cutting in and out until we gave up. After ending the failed call, I noticed something odd. Despite the video call being disconnected, my laptop's network activity indicator showed continuous data transfer, uploading and downloading at significant rates. I opened my network monitoring application, something I rarely used but had installed months earlier when troubleshooting a different issue. The interface displayed active connections between my device and multiple unfamiliar IP addresses. Data was flowing through ports I hadn't authorized. My first thought was malware. Perhaps I'd clicked something I shouldn't have, and now my computer was part of some botnet. I initiated security scans, closed all applications, and even physically disconnected from the internet by unplugging my router. The network activity indicator went dark, as expected. I reconnected and immediately observed the unauthorized data transfer resuming. The security scans found nothing suspicious. The next day, the internet technician arrived while I was at work. When I returned home that evening, I found a note in broken English explaining that no issues had been detected with the external connection. The technician had reset my router and suggested the problem might be with my laptop. The note included standard recommendations: restart the device, clear the cache, check for system updates. I followed these instructions, even performing a system restore to a point weeks earlier. The unauthorized network activity continued. What changed was my internet speed. No longer degraded, but functioning at its usual remarkable pace, despite the mysterious data transfers happening in the background. That night, I received a message from a username I didn't recognize on a messaging platform I rarely used. The message contained only a link, no text. Normally, I would never click such a thing, but exhaustion and frustration had worn down my usual caution. The link led to what appeared to be a troubleshooting forum in Korean. Using a browser translation tool, I could make out technical discussions about network routing, VPN configurations, and bandwidth allocation. One thread caught my attention, a conversation about something called passive nodes in residential networks. The translation was imperfect, but I gathered that certain high-speed connections in densely populated areas could be utilized as relay points for data transmission without the user's knowledge. The thread described this as a common practice among certain online communities requiring anonymized traffic. As I scrolled through the discussion, a private message appeared from a forum user with the name Node Manager. Translated, the message asked if I was experiencing connectivity issues and offered assistance. I hesitantly explained my situation, the unexplained data transfers, the initial speed degradation, the failed troubleshooting attempts. The response came quickly, explaining that my internet connection had likely been incorporated into a private routing network without my authorization. The initial slowdown occurred during the integration process, but now that my connection was fully configured as a node, the system was allocating resources more efficiently, allowing both normal usage and background data relay. I asked what kind of data was being transmitted through my connection. The response was vague. Secure communications requiring privacy protection, nothing illegal, nothing that would be traced back to me. When I expressed concern about having my network used without consent, Node Manager offered to remove my connection from their system for a fee in cryptocurrency. This had all the hallmarks of a scam, but the technical details matched exactly what I was experiencing. I declined the payment option and stated my intention to report this to my internet provider and local authorities. The final message I received contained just 2 words in English: watch first. A moment later, a link appeared. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I clicked it. The page that loaded had a minimal interface, a black background, a video player in the center, a timestamp, and a view account showing 17. The video showed an empty room with white walls. The timestamp indicated the feed was live. For several minutes, nothing happened. I was about to close the browser when a person entered the frame. Their face was obscured by digital pixelation, but their body language suggested nervousness. They sat in a chair facing the camera and held up a piece of paper with writing I couldn't read from the angle shown. The viewer count increased to 23. A small text field appeared below the video, showing messages in various languages. Using translation tools, I could see viewers asking for the subject to perform specific actions. Most requests were simple: raise a hand, stand up, turn around. The person complied with each instruction, movements becoming increasingly reluctant as the request continued. I closed the browser, deeply disturbed by whatever I had witnessed. Within seconds, my messenger pinged with another message from Node Manager. An image of my face, captured moments earlier through my laptop's webcam, which I'd never activated. Below the image was text explaining that my network node was being used to route encrypted streams for a private viewing community. Attempting to interfere would result in my transition from relay point to content subject. I shut down my laptop immediately, unplugged all devices, and spent a sleepless night contemplating my options. The next morning, I purchased a new laptop and a mobile hotspot, from a provider different from my home internet service. Using this completely separate connection, I researched what I had stumbled into. Information was sparse and contradictory. Some sources dismissed red rooms as urban legends, technically impossible due to bandwidth limitations of anonymized networks. Others suggested they existed, but were elaborate scams. Staged performances marketed as authentic to separate cryptocurrency from gullible viewers. A few troubling accounts described them as genuine operations run by technically sophisticated criminal networks exploiting high-speed infrastructure in countries with advanced digital ecosystems. South Korea, with its extraordinary connectivity and dense urban population, appeared repeatedly in these discussions. The country's internet speeds, among the fastest globally, made it ideal for services requiring substantial bandwidth. Its urban density meant residential connections could be compromised without drawing attention, lost in the digital noise of millions of concurrent users. I considered reporting my experience to authorities but hesitated. My visa status made me reluctant to draw official attention. My limited Korean would make explaining the technical nuances difficult. Most importantly, I had no evidence beyond the messages on my compromised laptop, which I was now afraid to access again. Instead, I contacted a cybersecurity consultant recommended in an expatriate forum. We met in a busy cafe where I explained the situation. His expression remained neutral throughout my account, but his questions became increasingly specific about the interface I had seen, the routing methods described, and the patterns of data transfer. After I finished, he explained that what I had encountered was unfortunately real. Certain buildings in Seoul, particularly those with direct connections to the city's advanced fiber infrastructure, were specifically targeted for integration into these networks. Foreign residents were preferred targets, less likely to report issues, more likely to attribute problems to cultural or language misunderstandings, often living alone with fewer people to notice strange digital occurrences. The consultant offered to secure my new devices and investigate my home network for a substantial fee. Desperate for help, I agreed. 2 days later, he came to my apartment, bringing specialized equipment to analyze the connection without directly engaging with it. His examination confirmed what Node Manager had claimed. My internet service had been configured as a relay node for encrypted streams, with a secondary function allowing remote access to connected devices. The modification was sophisticated, operating at the router firmware level. Simply replacing the router wouldn't solve the problem, as the access point in the building's telecommunications closet had also been compromised. Moving to a different provider wouldn't help either, as most used the same physical infrastructure in this area. The consultant implemented temporary security measures, a hardware firewall, encrypted DNS services, VPN protocols, while acknowledging these were bandages on a more fundamental problem. His recommendation was blunt: move to a different building as soon as possible. Until then, assume all connected devices were potentially compromised. I began searching for a new apartment immediately, but lease terms in Seoul are complicated, typically requiring substantial deposits and minimum stay periods. Breaking my current contract would mean losing thousands of dollars I couldn't afford to forfeit. A week after implementing the security measures, I received a paper letter in my mailbox, unusual in itself, as most communications in Seoul are digital. The letter contained a printed screenshot of my new laptop's desktop, taken the previous day, along with a list of websites I had visited while researching new apartments. The message was clear: the security measures had failed or been circumvented. That night, my apartment lost power briefly, just a few seconds, but long enough to reset all electronic devices. When service resumed, the hardware firewall the consultant had installed showed its configuration had been reset to default settings. The VPN connection had disconnected. The specialized DNS settings had reverted. I contacted the consultant again, who seemed genuinely disturbed by this development. The level of access required to coordinate a targeted power interruption with immediate reconfiguration of security devices suggested resources beyond typical hackers. He advised me to leave the apartment immediately, even if it meant financial loss. I spent that night in a hotel, using only my mobile phone with a new SIM card purchased with cash. In the morning, I returned to my apartment to pack essential items, planning to stay with a colleague until finding new housing. As I entered, my phone received a notification despite being disconnected from Wi-Fi and using the new SIM. The message contained my current location coordinates and the simple text, "Node status remains active." I packed quickly, taking only what would fit in a backpack. As I was leaving, my neighbor, the one who had reported no internet issues, was entering his apartment. He nodded in greeting, then paused, looking at my backpack. He asked in perfect English if I was going somewhere. When I vaguely mentioned visiting a friend, he smiled and said perhaps my internet issues would be resolved when I returned. Something in his expression made me deeply uncomfortable. I mumbled a response and hurried away, but not before noticing a small pin on his lapel, a design I recognized from the forum, where I had first encountered discussions of passive nodes. The icon resembled a stylized eye with a digital motif. I never returned to that apartment. I forfeited my deposit, left most of my possessions, and moved to a different district of Seoul. I changed jobs, altered my online presence, and replaced all electronic devices. For several months, I detected no unusual network activities or unexplained communications. Then yesterday, while using a public Wi-Fi connection at a cafe I'd never previously visited, I received an email to an address I had created only weeks earlier and shared with no one. The message contained a single image, a screenshot of the coffee shop's security camera feed showing me sitting at my current table, captured moments earlier. Below was a view account, 31. I don't know if I'll ever escape this network. It exists in the infrastructure itself, in the invisible digital pathways we've woven through our modern world. Sometimes I wonder how many others are unknowingly serving as nodes, their connections becoming conduits for streams they'll never see, their cameras capturing moments they don't know are being shared. The internet has no memory limitations, no capacity for mercy, no mechanism for true deletion. Somewhere in that vast digital architecture, everything is preserved, including, I suspect, whatever they recorded through my devices during those weeks. I've become content in a library I can't access, viewed by people I'll never identify. What terrifies me most isn't that I'm still being watched. It's the possibility that I always was, that the entire digital ecosystem we've built is fundamentally, architecturally designed for observation, not by governments or corporations, but by whoever has the technical skill to access its deeper functions. And in that shadow network, latency isn't just a measure of connection speed. It's the delay between becoming a node and realizing you've always been a subject. I never intended to find it. Most people who stumble onto the darker corners of the internet are actively looking, following breadcrumbs of urban legends and whispered rumors. Not me. I was just doing my job. I work in digital forensics for an insurance company. Nothing glamorous, mostly analyzing data from car accident claims, verifying timestamps on property damage photos, that sort of thing. Occasionally, we get cases involving potential fraud, where someone might have manipulated evidence. That's what led me down this particular rabbit hole. A claim had come in for a high-end electronics store that had allegedly been robbed. The security camera footage showed masked figures breaking in after hours and methodically clearing out the most valuable merchandise. Standard stuff. But something about the video felt off to me. The timestamps were consistent. The metadata looked normal. But certain compression artifacts appeared in patterns that didn't match typical security camera encoding. I've spent enough time analyzing video to recognize when something's been processed through multiple systems. This footage had signatures suggesting it had been routed through some kind of streaming service before being downloaded and submitted as evidence. Again, not necessarily suspicious on its own. Many modern security systems upload to cloud servers automatically, but combined with a few other anomalies, it merited deeper investigation. I traced the video's digital fingerprint backward, following a trail of encoding signatures and network markers. The insurance company gives us considerable technical leeway when investigating potential fraud, so I had access to specialized tools and databases not available to the general public. What I expected to find was evidence that the footage had been staged, perhaps an inside job disguised as a break-in. What I found instead was a pathway leading to a closed network operating through a series of proxy servers and encryption layers. The security footage hadn't just been processed through standard cloud storage. It had been live streamed to a private audience before being repurposed as evidence for the insurance claim. Professional curiosity got the better of me. I followed the digital trail, using access tools that technically fell within my job description, but definitely pushed ethical boundaries. After 3 days of careful tracing, I found myself looking at an unmarked website, accessible only through specialized routing protocols. The landing page was minimal, just a login screen with no company name, no graphics, no identifying information of any kind. Using analytical techniques that I'd rather not detail, I managed to access the site's back-end database. What I found was a sophisticated streaming platform with hundreds of active feeds organized into categories. Most feeds showed empty rooms, parked cars, streetscapes, or other mundane settings. Each had viewership metrics, timestamping, and user interaction logs. This wasn't some amateur operation. It was a professional-grade surveillance network with global reach. One category caught my attention: scheduled events. Unlike the passive surveillance feeds, these had specific start times, viewer registration requirements, and something called interaction parameters. The most recent scheduled event had occurred the previous night, with the cryptic title Inventory Reduction Phase 3. When I checked the archived footage, I found myself watching the same robbery that had been submitted in our insurance claim. The implications hit me all at once. This wasn't footage of an actual robbery. This was something staged specifically for an audience, filmed to appear like security camera footage, then repurposed as evidence for a fraudulent insurance claim. The thieves were performers. The stolen merchandise was probably moved out through legitimate channels, while the insurance company paid for the supposed loss. Clever as far as fraud schemes go, but what disturbed me more was the viewership data. 63 people had watched this staged robbery live, many paying significant amounts in cryptocurrency for the privilege. The interactive log showed viewers sending real-time messages suggesting how the thieves should behave, which items to take, whether to vandalize the space, how to position themselves for better camera angles. I should have reported my findings immediately, compiled the evidence for our fraud investigation team, and moved on. Instead, I kept digging, curious about the other scheduled events in the system. Most had innocuous titles that gave little indication of their content. Night Shift Protocol, Wellness Check 17, Conditioning Session. The viewership numbers varied from as few as 10 to over 100, with corresponding price tiers. The next scheduled event was something called Home Evaluation Series, Residence 28, set to begin at 1 a.m. the following night. Against every ethical guideline and professional standard, I decided to observe it. I told myself it was necessary for building a comprehensive fraud case. In reality, I was simply curious. A curiosity I've regretted every day since. I took precautions, using a secured connection and routing through multiple proxies. At 12:55 a.m., I accessed the platform and found the upcoming stream already had 47 registered viewers. A countdown timer showed 5 minutes remaining. The preview image displayed what looked like ordinary home security camera footage of a living room. Sofa, television, coffee table. Typical suburban decor. Nothing unusual or particularly interesting. At exactly 1 a.m., the stream went live. The initial view showed the living room from a corner ceiling perspective, mimicking standard home security positioning. For several minutes, nothing happened. The empty room, dimly lit by a small lamp, remained still and silent. The viewership count ticked up to 53. A text interface at the bottom of the screen showed viewers sending messages, most expressing anticipation or discussing technical aspects of the camera setup. At 1:08 a.m., a new camera angle activated, showing what appeared to be a bedroom. A person was sleeping in the bed, unaware of being observed by dozens of strangers. The camera angle was positioned to show the entire room, with particular focus on the bedroom door and window. Again, messages scrolled as viewers discussed the setting, the subject, and something they referred to as entry methods. With growing discomfort, I realized I was watching someone's actual home, accessed through their own security system, without their knowledge. The viewers weren't just passive observers. They were actively discussing how to enter this residence. This wasn't entertainment, it was premeditation. At 1:17 a.m., a third camera angle activated, showing the exterior of the house, specifically the back door and patio area. A figure in dark clothing appeared at the edge of the frame, moving carefully toward the door. Messages from viewers increased rapidly, many sending specific instructions about the lock mechanism, based on what they could see in the high-definition footage. I was witnessing the planning and execution of a home invasion, being live-streamed to paying viewers who were actively participating in the process. This went far beyond insurance fraud or staged robberies. This was real, happening in real time, to an unsuspecting victim. I frantically tried to identify the location, searching for any distinguishing features in the footage, street signs through windows, mail with an address, anything that could help me alert authorities. But the camera angles were carefully chosen to avoid revealing identifying details. The only geographic clue was a weather alert visible on a phone screen on the nightstand, suggesting a location somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. As the figure began working on the back door lock, I made a decision. I had to report this immediately, even if it meant admitting I had accessed the platform without authorization. I disconnected from the stream and called the FBI's cyber division. Using an anonymous reporting system, I provided everything I had: the network pathways, access methods, descriptions of what I'd witnessed, and the connection to our insurance fraud case. The next morning, I arrived at work to find 2 federal agents waiting in our company's security office. For 3 hours, they questioned me about how I had discovered the streaming platform, what I had observed, and whether I had participated in any way beyond viewing. They seemed less interested in the home invasion I had reported, and more focused on the broader network infrastructure. They took custody of all my research materials and requested I not discuss the matter with anyone else while their investigation proceeded. That evening, I searched news sources for any reports of a home invasion in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing appeared that matched what I had witnessed. Either it hadn't made the news, hadn't actually occurred, or it happened somewhere entirely different than I had assumed. 2 days later, I received an email from an address consisting only of numbers. The subject line read, "Viewer Analytics Report." The message contained a single line of text. "Your observation patterns have been flagged for review." Attached was a detailed file analyzing my viewing behavior during the brief time I had accessed the platform. How long I had watched each camera angle, which parts of the frame my cursor had hovered over, timestamps of when I had been active versus idle. It concluded with an assessment that I displayed intervention probability indicators that made me an unsuitable viewing participant. The precision of this analysis was chilling. Whatever system they were using could track not just that I had viewed the stream, but exactly how I had engaged with it, right down to my mouse movements and hesitations. They knew I wasn't a genuine customer. They knew I was likely to report what I had seen. I changed all my passwords, reformatted my work computer, and swept my home for surveillance devices. I found nothing unusual, but the feeling of being monitored persisted. A week passed without incident. The federal agents didn't contact me again. The anonymous email address sent nothing further. Our fraud investigation proceeded without any mention of what I had discovered. I began to wonder if I had overreacted. Perhaps the streaming platform was actually some elaborate role-playing game where participants pretended to plan crimes. Perhaps the home and its sleeping occupant were staged setups with paid actors, like the electronics store robbery. Such an explanation wouldn't make it legal, but it would at least be less immediately dangerous. Then the photographs arrived. Standard 4x6 prints in a plain white envelope, no return address, delivered to my apartment mailbox. 5 photos in total. The first showed me entering my workplace, taken from what appeared to be a security camera across the street. The second showed me at a coffee shop I frequented, captured from the shop's own surveillance system. The third was me getting into my car in a grocery store parking lot. The fourth showed the exterior of my apartment building. The fifth photo showed me asleep in my bed, taken from an angle high in the corner of my bedroom. I have no security cameras in my apartment. No webcams positioned where that photo could have been taken. No devices with cameras directed toward my bed. Yet there it was, proof that someone had been watching me sleep, just as I had watched a stranger sleep through that live stream. I went to the police, showed them the photos, explained the situation. They took a report, checked my apartment for signs of breaking and entering, found nothing disturbed. No evidence of how the bedroom photo had been taken. They suggested installing better locks, getting a security system, being more aware of my surroundings. Standard advice that completely missed the point of what was happening. Over the next few weeks, more envelopes arrived. Each contained a single photo showing me in situations where I believed I was unobserved. Reading on my balcony, showering, captured from outside the bathroom window. Working late at my desk. Each photo had a timestamp and a viewership count printed in the bottom corner. Apparently, 16 people had watched me shower. 23 had observed me sleeping. 31 had seen me working at my desk. I moved to a different apartment, changed jobs, altered my appearance, and adjusted my routine. The photos kept coming, now delivered to my new address. Sometimes they would arrive within hours of being taken, proving they weren't the result of long-term surveillance, but active, ongoing observation. The most recent envelope arrived yesterday. Instead of photographs, it contained a small card with a printed message. Home Evaluation Series, Residence 43, scheduled for 1 a.m. Estimated viewers, 58 primary subject. U interaction parameters extended. Below this was a link to the streaming platform I had discovered months ago. I'm not going to be in my apartment at 1 a.m. tonight. I won't be anywhere they can easily find me. I've disabled or disposed of anything that could potentially be used to track my location. This message was typed on a public computer, and I'll be somewhere else entirely by the time anyone reads it. I still don't fully understand what I've stumbled into. Some kind of voyeuristic network that repurposes security systems for entertainment. A criminal organization that combines surveillance with burglary and fraud. Something with even darker purposes that I haven't yet discerned. What I do know is that in this system, the distinction between observer and observed is fluid. Today's viewer becomes tomorrow's unwitting performer. The cameras that make us feel secure are the same ones that make us vulnerable. And somewhere out there right now, someone is watching footage of ordinary people in supposedly private moments, never realizing that they themselves are being watched through the very screen they're using to observe others. The most disturbing part isn't that I'm being monitored. It's the realization that I probably always was. The platform I discovered didn't create this surveillance network. It merely monetized what already existed. Our world is saturated with cameras we've willingly installed, with devices that listen and watch, with systems designed to track our movements and behaviors. We've built our own panopticon and called it convenience, called it security, called it connection. I don't know who will be watching at 1 a.m. tonight. I don't know what extended interaction parameters means in this context, but I do know that whatever happens, it will be recorded, categorized, and stored for future viewers. Another node in an ever-expanding network of observed moments. And somewhere in that database is footage of me watching someone else, unaware that I was already part of the performance. I still remember the exact moment I realized it wasn't a prank. There was something about the bruises on his face that looked too real, too painful. And his eyes, God, his eyes as he stared directly into that camera. I've never seen genuine fear like that before, not from Jay. It started innocently enough, just another weird link my friend Jay had found on some obscure forum. He was always sending us these things, supposed red rooms or whatever from the dark web. You know how it goes, always with a bunch of laughing emojis like it was all just a big joke. And it always was, until it wasn't. Jay was the kind of person who exhausted you just by existing. Actually, that sounds harsh. Let me rephrase that. He had this constant need for attention that could be draining. He was always staging these elaborate pranks, fake ghost encounters on video calls, prank calls to forum moderators that he'd record. And once, he even created this whole fictional stalker just to get karma on Reddit. The guy lived for reactions. Any reaction. I usually just went along with it. Never fully believed his stunts, but I'd play along because, well, he was my friend. Sometimes his pranks crossed lines. Occasionally they were genuinely funny, but mostly they were just a lot too much. So when that Red Room link appeared in our group chat, I didn't even bother clicking. Just another one of Jay's attempts to get us all worked up, I thought. But something felt off that week. Jay wasn't his usual self. He wasn't bombarding the chat with his typical nonsense. He wasn't trying to one-up everyone's stories. He was just quiet. I remember thinking maybe he'd finally grown bored of his own antics. Or perhaps he'd been banned from some platform again. But I kept coming back to the last thing he sent us. Something about this link being legitimate, about using headphones, about being warned. Then he disappeared. At first, I didn't think much of it. Jay had a habit of vanishing for days at a time, usually chasing after some girl he'd met online. He'd resurface eventually with wildly exaggerated stories that none of us believed. But this time felt different. It stretched on too long. On the third day, his mother called me. I still get chills thinking about that call. Her voice had this tremor to it that I'd never heard before. She explained that Jay hadn't been home, that his phone was completely off. I tried to reassure her, told her it was probably just another one of his elaborate pranks. But there was this moment, this awful, gut-wrenching moment, when her voice broke while telling me he'd left without his camera. Jay never went anywhere without that camera, ever. It was like an extension of himself. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I promised I'd come over to check his room, maybe look through his computer for any clues. I wish I could go back to that moment. I wish I'd just stayed home. His room was exactly as he'd left it, messy, full of half-finished projects. I checked his laptop first, nothing unusual. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed his desk drawer was slightly open. I probably wouldn't have looked inside if it had been closed completely. Funny how such small decisions change everything. There it was, a flash drive hidden behind a stack of old Polaroids, labeled with red marker, if gone. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to just hand it over to his mother, or maybe to the police. But curiosity, or maybe a misplaced sense of responsibility, got the better of me. I took it home and plugged it into my computer. What happened next still haunts me. The drive auto-launched a single file. No name, no extension. Just static at first, and then there was Jay, tied to a metal chair. The lighting was dim, like there was a single bulb hanging somewhere just out of frame. He was gagged. He was crying, trying desperately to communicate something. He looked genuinely terrified. Not the fake scared he'd do for his videos, not acting. This was raw fear. I had to pause it. I physically couldn't continue watching. I remember standing up so fast my chair tipped over. I paced around my room, trying to convince myself this was just another one of his elaborate stunts. Maybe for a film project. Maybe for some weird internet challenge. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I finally worked up the courage to look at the drive again, something impossible had happened. There were now 3 videos. I swear on everything I believe in, I hadn't downloaded anything else. I hadn't clicked anything. They just appeared. The second video was worse, much worse. Jay was still in that same chair, but his face was now swollen and bruised. His lip was split open, and his pinky finger, I still have nightmares about this. It was just gone. The stub was wrapped in dirty-looking duct tape and gauze, but it was clearly missing. And the way he looked at the camera, it was like he was looking directly at me, silently pleading, that same light swinging somewhere above him, creating these shifting shadows across his face. You know when something is so horrific your brain refuses to process it? When you keep telling yourself it must be fake, even though every instinct is screaming that it's real. That's where I was, staring at my screen, hands shaking so badly I could barely move the mouse, telling myself it had to be special effects or some digital manipulation. But it wasn't. It was real, It was happening. Then the screen glitched. For just a second, everything went black. When the image returned, there was text on the screen. Just one word. Vote. I scrolled down without thinking, and that's when I saw them. 3 buttons below the video: remove left hand, pull tooth no water for 24 hours. I froze. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. Was this some kind of sick interactive video? A game? I didn't mean to interact with it at all, but I hovered my cursor over the no water option, just to see if it was actually clickable. The screen blinked. A message appeared. Your vote has been counted. I panicked. I ripped the flash drive out of my computer so violently I'm surprised it didn't break. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I couldn't stop shaking. I was convinced I'd done something terrible, that I'd somehow participated in whatever nightmare Jay was trapped in, that I'd made things worse. Later that night, after hours of pacing and panicking, I checked the drive again. There was a 4th file. Same setup, same chair, same swinging light. But now Jay was blindfolded, still gagged. There were these horrible marks on his arms, like wires had been wrapped around them and pulled tight. I could barely bring myself to watch, but I forced myself to. I needed to understand what was happening. At the very end of the clip, just before it cut to black, Jay moved his lips. There was no sound, but I could read what he was trying to say. One word: run. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept seeing his face when I closed my eyes. The following morning, I took everything to the police. The drive, the videos, the voting page. I showed them all of it. I was desperate for them to tell me it was all an elaborate hoax, that Jay was fine, that this was just some dark corner of the internet playing tricks on me. But they couldn't say that. Instead, they told me there was no way to trace where the files had come from. The metadata had been wiped clean. The source was encrypted. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. They took the drive as evidence and told me not to share anything about this online. Then they sent me home. That was 3 weeks ago. Jay is still missing. His room remains untouched. His camera still sits on his desk where he left it. His mother calls me every day, asking if I've heard anything new. I never know what to tell her. I've deleted our group chat, blocked everyone else who was in it. I don't even open my browser without a VPN now. I've become paranoid about everything digital, every link, every file, every innocent-looking attachment. Sometimes I dream about that swinging light bulb, that dull, rhythmic sway casting moving shadows. I can hear it even when I'm awake, that faint creaking sound. The last thing Jay told us before he disappeared was that clicking the link could get us killed. I laughed it off then. I'm not laughing anymore. It started with a conversation at work. I was having lunch with a colleague from the IT department who'd been going on about online privacy and government surveillance. Nothing particularly radical, just the usual complaints about data collection and targeted advertising that everyone seems to have these days. But then he mentioned something about encrypted networks and hidden services that caught my attention. I'm not particularly tech savvy, mind you. I work in marketing for a small firm in Birmingham, and my computer skills extend about as far as PowerPoint presentations and the occasional Excel spreadsheet. But something about what he'd said intrigued me. The idea that there was this entire hidden layer of the internet that most people never even knew existed, running parallel to our normal browsing. He'd been quite vague about the details, probably assuming I wouldn't be interested or wouldn't understand the technical aspects. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself researching it later that evening. It took me the better part of a week to figure out how to access these hidden networks. I won't go into the technical details because, frankly, I barely understood them myself. But after following various online guides and downloading the necessary software, I finally found myself staring at a very basic-looking browser window that promised access to this shadowy corner of the web. The first few sites I visited were disappointingly mundane. Forums discussing privacy rights, marketplaces selling things that were questionable but hardly shocking, and a lot of political discussion that seemed more paranoid than dangerous. It was all rather anticlimactic, to be honest. I'd expected something more sinister, more obviously criminal. But then I stumbled across a link buried deep in one of the forums. It was just a string of random characters with no description, posted by someone with an equally meaningless username. Something about its anonymity made me curious enough to click. The page that loaded was stark black with red text. No fancy graphics, no navigation menu, just a simple message. Live rooms available, premium access only. Below that was a list of what looked like room numbers, each with a small viewer count next to it. Most showed 0 or 1 viewer, but a few had numbers in the teens or 20s. I clicked on one of the rooms with a moderate viewer count, expecting perhaps some sort of chat room or video conference. Instead, I was met with a login screen requesting payment details for what it called viewing privileges. The amounts weren't astronomical, but they weren't trivial either. About what you might spend on a decent meal out. Common sense should have kicked in at that point. I should have closed the browser and forgotten about the whole thing. But curiosity is a powerful motivator, and I found myself entering my card details before I'd really thought it through. The room I entered appeared to be someone's living space, filmed from a fixed camera angle in the corner. It wasn't particularly interesting at first glance. A sofa, a coffee table, some bookshelves. The lighting was dim, and the image quality wasn't great. I began to wonder what exactly I was paying to watch. Then I noticed the timer in the corner of the screen, counting down from what looked like about 40 minutes, and below that, a chat box where viewers could apparently send messages. Most of them seemed to be requests or suggestions, though I couldn't quite make sense of what they were referring to. I was about to leave when a figure entered the frame. They were wearing dark clothing and moved with deliberate, measured steps. What struck me immediately was how they seemed to acknowledge the camera, looking directly at it and nodding slightly, as if greeting the viewers. The person moved to the coffee table and began arranging items on its surface. Even through the grainy video feed, I could see they were being very methodical about it. Tools of some sort laid out in precise rows. The chat activity increased dramatically during this process, with messages appearing faster than I could read them. That's when I began to understand what I was watching. The room had another occupant, someone sitting in a chair that had been just outside the camera's view, until the first person adjusted its angle slightly. This second individual appeared to be restrained, though the poor video quality made it difficult to be certain of details. My finger hovered over the close button on my browser. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to shut this down and never think about it again. But I found myself frozen, unable to look away from the screen. The timer continued counting down. The chat messages became increasingly specific and disturbing, and the person in dark clothing continued their methodical preparations, occasionally glancing at the camera as if checking on their audience. I want to say that I closed the browser immediately, that I reported what I'd seen to the police and tried to forget about the whole experience. But that wouldn't be entirely truthful. I watched for another 10 minutes, before finally managing to close the window. 10 minutes during which I witnessed things that I still can't properly process, let alone describe. 10 minutes that have fundamentally changed how I see the world around me. The worst part wasn't even what I saw, though that was horrific enough. It was the realization of how easily I'd found it, how simple the payment process had been, and how many other viewers were in that room with me. People just like me, presumably, sitting in their homes and choosing to watch something unspeakable unfold in real time. I deleted all the software from my computer that night and tried to convince myself it had all been some sort of elaborate fake. Special effects, actors, a sick form of entertainment designed to shock gullible viewers. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep properly, couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line that I could never uncross. I'd become complicit in something terrible simply by being a witness to it. But worse than the guilt was the curiosity that lingered. Questions that I couldn't get out of my head. Who were those people? Where was that room? Were there others? How many others? It took me nearly a week to resist the urge to log back in. When I finally did, the site had changed. The room I'd visited was no longer on the list, replaced by others with different numbers but similar viewer counts. The black and red interface was exactly the same, as was the payment system. It was as if nothing had happened, as if what I'd witnessed had been just another evening's entertainment that was now archived somewhere in the digital ether. I clicked on a different room this time, then another. Each one showed a similar setup, a fixed camera angle, a timer, a chat box, and eventually the same type of methodical preparation I'd seen before. The third room I visited was different though. The camera angle was wider, showing more of the space. It looked like a basement or cellar with concrete walls and harsh lighting. Multiple chairs were visible in the frame, though only one was occupied initially. As I watched, more figures entered the room. They moved with the same deliberate precision I'd observed before, but there were more of them this time. The chat activity exploded as viewers reacted to this development, and I found myself reading messages that made my stomach turn. The timer for this room showed nearly 2 hours remaining. I realized then that this wasn't just some sick individual operating alone. This was organized, professional. There were multiple locations, multiple performers, and clearly multiple audiences willing to pay for access. The scale of it hit me like a physical blow. How many rooms were there? How many viewers? How long had this been going on? And most disturbingly, how had it remained hidden for so long if access was this straightforward? I started keeping a notebook after that, documenting room numbers, viewer counts, and any details I could discern about the locations. I told myself I was gathering evidence, that I'd eventually find a way to report this to the authorities. But really, I think I was just trying to make sense of something that defied comprehension. The rooms seemed to operate on different schedules. Some were active during typical evening hours in the UK. Others seemed timed for different zones entirely. The production values varied as well. Some were clearly amateur setups with poor lighting and single cameras, while others showed signs of more sophisticated equipment and planning. What remained consistent was the audience participation element. Viewers could influence what happened through the chat system, though I never fully understood the mechanics of how requests were prioritized or implemented. There seemed to be some sort of hierarchy among the viewers, with certain usernames appearing to carry more weight than others. I began recognizing regular participants, usernames that appeared across multiple rooms, sometimes making similar requests or comments. It was like discovering a community of people united by their shared interest in witnessing these events. A community that I was now, technically, part of. The realization made me physically ill, but I kept watching, night after night, room after room. I told myself I was documenting evidence, but I knew that was just an excuse. The truth was that I'd become addicted to the horror of it, addicted to being witness to things that most people couldn't even imagine existed. The rooms began to feel familiar. I started recognizing certain locations that appeared repeatedly, suggesting these weren't random one-off events. Some rooms seemed to have regular schedules, with timers appearing at predictable intervals. Others were more sporadic, popping up without warning and disappearing just as quickly. I also began to notice patterns in the chat conversations, certain phrases that seemed to have specific meanings, references to other sites that I didn't dare investigate, and occasionally discussions about meeting in person, though these messages would disappear quickly. Someone was clearly watching the conversations. Someone was controlling who could access these rooms, taking the payments, and presumably organizing what happened in them. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. 3 weeks into my nightly visits, something happened that changed everything. I was watching a room that had become one of my regular stops, a space that looked like a converted garage, with medical equipment visible in the background. The timer showed about 30 minutes remaining when a new figure entered the frame. This person was different from the usual performers. They moved hesitantly, looking around as if confused or disoriented. And when they turned toward the camera, I could see their face clearly for the first time. I recognized them. Not personally, but from the news. It was someone who'd been reported missing from Manchester about a month earlier. A university student whose disappearance had made the local headlines and prompted police appeals for information. The room's chat exploded with activity as other viewers apparently made the same connection. Messages referencing news articles, speculating about timelines, discussing the implications. Some viewers seemed excited by this development, while others expressed concern about the increased risk. I sat staring at my screen, paralyzed by the implications of what I was seeing. This wasn't just some underground entertainment network. These were real people. People who were being held against their will. People whose families were presumably still hoping for their safe return. I should have called the police immediately. Should have screenshot everything, documented the room details, and handed it all over to the authorities. But instead, I found myself continuing to watch, transfixed by the horror of it all. The missing student was clearly distressed, looking around the room frantically and trying to communicate with someone off camera. The usual methodical preparations began, but this time they seemed different, more urgent. The chat discussion had shifted as well, with viewers debating whether this level of publicity was worth the risk. 20 minutes into the session, something unprecedented happened. The feed cut out abruptly, replaced by a simple error message. The room disappeared from the available list, and when I tried to access it again, I received a message saying it was no longer available. The chat was buzzing with speculation about what had gone wrong. Some viewers suggested technical difficulties, others worried about police intervention. A few seemed angry about losing access to what they'd paid for. But within an hour, the room was back online with a different number and what appeared to be a completely different setup. The missing student was nowhere to be seen, and the usual proceedings continued as if nothing had happened. I never saw that particular individual again in any of the rooms I visited. Whether they'd been moved to a different location, or whether something worse had happened, I have no way of knowing. But but their brief appearance had shattered any remaining illusions I'd maintained about the nature of what I was witnessing. These weren't volunteers or actors. These were victims. I stopped taking notes after that night, stopped trying to convince myself that I was gathering evidence for some future police report. Instead, I simply watched, night after night, consumed by a fascination that I knew was deeply wrong but couldn't seem to break. The rooms continued to operate with clockwork precision. New locations appeared regularly, while others disappeared without explanation. The viewer counts remained steady, suggesting a stable audience for this content, and the chat discussions continued to reveal the depth of this underground community. I began to wonder about the other viewers. Who were they? Where did they live? What did they do during the day before logging in to watch these sessions? Were they people I might know, might work with, might pass on the street? The anonymity of it all was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Everyone was hidden behind usernames, participating in something horrific, while maintaining their normal lives in the physical world. I was doing the same thing after all. During the day, I'd sit in meetings at work, discussing marketing strategies and quarterly targets, all while knowing that I'd be spending my evening watching things that would probably result in prison sentences for everyone involved. The disconnect was surreal. My sleep became increasingly erratic. When I did manage to drift off, I'd have vivid dreams about the rooms I'd visited, the faces I'd seen, the conversations I'd read. I'd wake up feeling complicit, as if I'd been physically present for these events rather than just watching from behind a screen. The guilt was overwhelming, but not enough to make me stop. It's been nearly 2 months now since I first found that initial link. I've seen things that I'll never be able to forget, learned things about human nature that I wish I could unlearn. And yet, most nights, I still find myself opening that familiar black browser window and navigating to those hidden corners of the internet. I tell myself I'll report it eventually, that I'll find the courage to contact the authorities and provide whatever information I can. But I know I won't, because doing so would mean admitting my own role in all of this, my own complicity in what amounts to a form of digital voyeurism of the worst kind. The most terrifying realization is how easy it all is, how simple it was to access, how straightforward the payment system, how seamlessly it all operates alongside the normal internet that everyone else uses. If I could stumble across it so easily, how many others are doing the same thing? How many people are out there right now, watching these rooms, participating in this community? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many more rooms are there that I haven't found yet? The timer in the corner of my current room shows 14 minutes remaining. The chat is active as usual, filled with the same types of requests and comments I've become accustomed to reading. Another evening for an audience of anonymous viewers, each of us safely hidden behind our screens, pretending that what we're witnessing isn't real. But it is real, and tomorrow night, I'll probably be back here again, watching another room, seeing another victim, being part of something that exists in the shadows of our connected world. I never meant to find it, but now that I have, I can't seem to look away. I used to think online anonymity made you safer, until I found out how easy it is for someone to find you when they really want to. Working at TechFix in Birmingham city centre wasn't exactly what I'd planned when I dropped out of college halfway through my computing course. The pay was rubbish, and most customers treated you like you were thick, but it beat signing on and gave me something to do while I figured out what came next. Plus, Dave, who owned the shop, was decent enough and didn't ask too many questions about why I'd left uni. The work was mostly straightforward: virus removals, hardware upgrades, data recovery for people who'd managed to delete their holiday photos. Nothing that required the sort of advanced knowledge they'd been trying to teach us at college. Just basic technical skills and patience with people who couldn't tell the difference between their desktop and their hard drive. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November when the woman came in with the laptop that changed everything. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed but nervous, the sort of customer who clearly didn't feel comfortable in computer shops. Her laptop had crashed completely, wouldn't boot up at all, and she needed some files recovered before a business meeting the following day. Standard data recovery job. I explained it would take a few hours to extract the files safely, and she could collect the laptop the next morning. She seemed relieved and left after paying the deposit. I didn't start working on it until later that afternoon. When I opened up the laptop case to check the hard drive, I found a USB stick wedged inside, not properly inserted into a port, just loose in the casing like it had fallen out of someone's pocket during a previous repair. It wasn't the customer's. She'd been very specific about what files she needed recovering, and they were all work documents stored on the main drive. This USB looked older, more worn, like it had been used heavily over several years. I should have just put it in the lost property box and forgotten about it. But curiosity got the better of me, especially during a quiet spell when Dave had popped out to the bank. I plugged it into my work computer to see if there was anything that might identify the owner. The USB contained a single folder labeled with a string of random letters and numbers. Inside that folder were more folders, each named with dates going back about 18 months. And inside those folders were video files. The first few I opened were obviously downloaded from streaming sites. Poor quality, generic content, nothing particularly unusual. But as I worked through the folders chronologically, the content became progressively more disturbing. These weren't random downloads from public sites. Someone had been systematically collecting footage of real violence, organized by date and location. Police body cam footage from crime scenes. Security camera recordings from incidents that had never been reported in the news. Mobile phone videos shot by witnesses to events that looked genuinely traumatic. The timestamps suggested the material was recent, some of it from just weeks before. Either someone had remarkable access to law enforcement databases, or they were connected to the people creating this content in the first place. Buried deeper in the folder structure, I found something that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the files. Live stream recordings, multiple files, each several hours long, showing what appeared to be real-time violence happening in various locations. The video quality was better than the other content, suggesting professional equipment rather than security cameras or phone recordings. These weren't just recordings either. The interface visible around the edges of the video showed chat windows, viewer counters, control panels. Someone had been participating in live streams where people could watch real violence happening as it occurred. The most recent folder contained something even worse. Rather than just recordings of streams, there were planning documents, schedules, location details, equipment lists. Someone wasn't just watching this content, they were involved in organizing it. One document caught my attention because it mentioned Birmingham specifically, a location I recognized from the address, a warehouse district about 20 minutes from the city centre, where several businesses had closed down over the past year, leaving empty buildings that would be perfect for activities people wanted to keep private. According to the schedule, something was planned for that location the following evening. I should have contacted the police immediately, should have handed over the USB and let them investigate whatever criminal operation was documented on it. But I knew how that conversation would sound. college dropout claiming to have found evidence of live murder streams on a random USB stick that may or may not have belonged to a customer. Instead, I copied some of the files to my personal laptop and spent the evening researching the locations mentioned in the documents. Most were commercial properties that had been empty for months, the sort of places where unusual activity might go unnoticed for weeks. The Birmingham warehouse was owned by a company that had gone into administration 6 months earlier. According to the business listings, it had been used for food storage, but satellite images showed it was now clearly abandoned, perfect for someone who needed a secure location away from residential areas. The planning documents suggested the operation was more sophisticated than I had initially assumed. Multiple camera positions, streaming equipment, backup systems. This wasn't amateur content. Someone was running what amounted to a professional production, just with considerably more disturbing subject matter than typical broadcasts. I found myself checking the documents obsessively over the next 24 hours, looking for more details about what was being planned. The scheduling information suggested regular events rather than one-off incidents, with different locations used on a rotating basis to avoid detection. By Wednesday evening, I'd convinced myself that I needed to see for myself what was happening at the warehouse, not to get involved or intervene, just to confirm whether the documents were describing something real or elaborate fiction. I drove out there around 8 o'clock, parking several streets away and approaching on foot through the industrial estate. Most of the businesses in the area closed early, leaving the roads empty except for the occasional lorry heading to the motorway. The warehouse was at the end of a cul-de-sac, separated from the other buildings by a car park that had been abandoned long enough for weeds to grow through the tarmac. From the outside, it looked completely derelict. Broken windows, graffiti on the walls, the sort of place teenagers might use for underage drinking. But there were fresh tire marks in the car park, and one of the loading bay doors was slightly ajar, despite looking secured from a distance. I circled the building looking for a vantage point where I could see inside without being noticed. The rear of the warehouse had several broken windows at ground level, covered with boards that had gaps large enough to see through. What I saw inside confirmed everything from the documents. The warehouse had been converted into a filming space. Professional lighting, equipment, multiple cameras positioned around a central area, computer stations along one wall. It looked like a television studio, except for the restraint equipment and the metal table positioned where you'd normally expect to see chairs or a sofa. There were 3 people setting up equipment, all dressed in ordinary clothes, like they were preparing for any normal work shift. Nothing theatrical or sinister about their appearance. They could have been setting up for a corporate video or product demonstration. The casual nature of their preparation was somehow more disturbing than if they'd been wearing masks or costumes. These were just people doing a job, even though that job involved creating content that would traumatize anyone with a functioning conscience. I watched for about an hour as they completed their setup and tested various pieces of equipment. Around 9:30, a van pulled up outside and 2 more people entered the building. One of them was carrying what appeared to be camera equipment. The other was supporting someone who seemed barely conscious. That's when I realized I wasn't just witnessing preparation. I was about to see the actual filming of whatever those documents had been planning. I should have called the police then. Should have run back to my car and driven straight to the nearest station to report what I was seeing. Instead, I stayed at the window, telling myself I needed more evidence before making accusations that could ruin innocent people's lives. The unconscious person was positioned on the metal table while the others made final adjustments to their equipment. Computer screens came alive, showing what looked like streaming interfaces, though I couldn't make out the details from my position outside. Then one of the camera operators looked directly at the window where I was watching. Not in my general direction, but specifically at the gap in the boards where my face was visible. Our eyes met through the broken glass, and I saw him say something to the others while pointing towards my location. I ran, made it back to my car, and drove home as quickly as possible without breaking every speed limit in Birmingham. Once I was safely back in my flat, I tried to process what I'd witnessed and decide what to do about it. The logical action was to contact the police with everything I'd seen and copied from the USB. But I knew how weak my story sounded. I'd essentially been stalking people based on files I'd stolen from a customer's property, then trespassing on private land to spy on what might have been legitimate business activity, and now someone had seen me watching them. I spent the rest of the evening checking that my flat was properly secured and trying to convince myself that the person at the warehouse had no way of identifying me. They'd seen my face for maybe 3 seconds in poor lighting conditions. Even if they wanted to find me, how could they possibly know who I was or where I lived? The next morning, I arrived at work to find the woman from Tuesday waiting outside the shop. She seemed different from when she'd first brought the laptop in. More confident, less nervous about being in a computer shop. She asked about her data recovery with the sort of casual interest you might show when collecting dry cleaning rather than the urgency she displayed initially. I handed over her laptop and the recovered files, expecting her to check everything was in order before leaving. Instead, she just smiled and asked if I'd found anything interesting while working on her machine. The question was innocent enough, but something about the way she asked it made my stomach drop, as if she already knew what I'd discovered and was testing whether I'd admit to it. I told her everything had gone smoothly and that all her files had been recovered successfully. She thanked me, paid the balance, and left without checking any of the work I'd supposedly done. But as she reached the door, she turned back with that same smile and mentioned that she hoped I'd found the warehouse visit educational. Then she was gone, leaving me standing behind the counter, trying to work out how she could possibly have known where I'd been the previous evening. I checked our customer database after she left. The contact details she'd provided led nowhere. Disconnected phone number, fake address, credit card that had been declined when I tried to process the final payment later that day. She'd never been a legitimate customer at all, which meant the entire laptop repair had been a setup to get the USB into the shop, knowing that whoever worked on the machine would eventually find it and look at the contents. Someone had wanted me to see those files, wanted me to go to the warehouse, wanted me to witness what was happening there. The question was why. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every customer who came into the shop seemed suspicious. Every person who looked in my direction on the street felt like a potential threat. I started varying my route home, checking behind me more often, sleeping with furniture pushed against my bedroom door. But nothing obvious happened. No threatening messages, no suspicious phone calls, no obvious signs that I was being followed. Just the persistent feeling that someone knew more about my daily routine than they should. A week later, I found another USB stick. This one was left on the counter at work while I was helping a customer in the back room. When I returned, it was sitting next to the till with a small note attached that simply said, "Next episode." I should have thrown it away immediately, or handed it to the police, or quit my job and moved to another city. Instead, I took it home and plugged it into my laptop. The files were similar to the first USB, but more recent. New locations, new scheduling documents, new recordings of events I didn't want to see, but couldn't stop watching. And buried in the folder structure was something that made my blood turn cold. Photos of me, not just from the warehouse. Dozens of images taken over the past week showing me walking to work, shopping for groceries, sitting in my flat with the curtains open. Someone had been documenting my daily routine with the systematic thoroughness of a professional surveillance operation. The final folder contained a single document with an address and a time. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. The location was another abandoned warehouse, this one on the other side of Birmingham. And at the bottom of the document, a single line of text that made it clear this wasn't an invitation. Your turn. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. The police won't believe a story this bizarre without evidence I can't provide without incriminating myself. Moving away won't help if these people have the resources to track me down once already. Tomorrow evening, I'll have to decide whether to go to that warehouse or spend the rest of my life wondering when they'll decide to come and find me instead. Either way, I don't think online anonymity is going to keep me safe much longer. I'd always been competitive with puzzles and problem-solving games, the sort of person who couldn't resist a Sudoku or crossword that others had given up on. My mates used to joke that I should try those online puzzle competitions where people solve increasingly difficult challenges for prize money. But I never thought I was good enough for that level of competition. That changed when I was 25 and unemployed in Leeds, spending most days applying for teaching jobs that never materialized while living off savings that were rapidly dwindling. The job market for history teachers was brutal, and I was starting to consider completely different career paths when something happened that made me realize my puzzle-solving hobby might actually be worth something. I'd been working through some logic problems on a free puzzle website when a message appeared offering access to more challenging content if I was interested in testing my skills against harder material. The invitation seemed automated, probably triggered by my completion time or accuracy rate, but it led to a section of the site I hadn't seen before. The puzzles there were considerably more complex than anything I'd encountered on mainstream puzzle platforms. Not just mathematical problems or logic games, but challenges that required research, pattern recognition across multiple data sources, and the sort of analytical thinking that goes beyond casual entertainment. Some challenges involved analyzing communication patterns in large datasets. Others required identifying connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. And a few demanded the kind of systematic investigation that reminded me of historical research methods I'd learned during my degree. The difficulty level was addictive. These weren't puzzles you could solve in a few minutes during a coffee break, but genuine intellectual challenges that required hours of focused analysis and creative problem-solving approaches. More importantly, the platform offered small payments for successfully completing certain challenges. Nothing substantial, but enough to make the time investment feel worthwhile when I wasn't earning anything through conventional job applications. Over several weeks, I worked through increasingly difficult challenges, earning modest amounts that helped offset my unemployment while keeping my analytical skills sharp during a period when I wasn't getting much intellectual stimulation. The challenges gradually shifted from abstract logic problems to tasks that involved analyzing real-world information. Some required researching public records and identifying patterns in business registrations. Others involved tracking information flow through social media platforms or news reporting. The analytical work was genuinely engaging, combining the satisfaction of puzzle solving with research skills that were directly relevant to my historical training. It felt like productive use of my education during a time when my actual qualifications weren't leading to employment opportunities. But as the challenges became more complex and better paid, they also started requiring access to information sources that weren't available through normal internet browsing. The platform provided specialized software that could access databases and information networks that weren't indexed by standard search engines. The research challenges using these alternative information sources were considerably more interesting than anything I'd worked on before. Instead of analyzing sanitized datasets or public information, I was working with raw communication logs, unfiltered social media activity, and comprehensive records that showed how information actually moved through digital networks. The analytical challenges required understanding not just what information was being shared, but how different groups used various platforms to coordinate activities, spread influence, and maintain privacy while conducting business or personal activities. Some challenges focused on identifying key influencers in specific online communities. Others involved mapping relationships between apparently unconnected individuals or organizations, and a few required analyzing the effectiveness of different communication strategies for achieving particular goals. The work was intellectually stimulating and felt like legitimate research that could potentially be valuable for academic or professional purposes. I was developing data analysis skills that might be relevant for future employment while earning enough to cover basic living expenses. But I also started noticing that some challenges involved analyzing information about people and organizations in Yorkshire, including details about businesses and individuals in Leeds and surrounding areas that I was familiar with from living in the region. The research wasn't focused on abstract or distant subjects, but was systematically analyzing real people and activities in my immediate geographic area. Some challenges required identifying vulnerabilities in local business operations. Others involved mapping social connections between specific individuals, and a few focused on analyzing personal communication patterns that revealed private information about real people's relationships and activities. I realized that my analytical work wasn't contributing to academic research or legitimate business intelligence, but was being used to compile detailed information about Yorkshire residents for purposes that weren't clearly explained. The puzzle-solving platform seemed to be using gamified challenges to recruit people with analytical skills for conducting systematic research into real people's private lives and business activities. When I questioned the purpose of the more invasive research challenges, the platform explained that understanding social and business networks was essential for various legitimate purposes, including market research, academic studies, and security analysis. They assured me that all information was obtained through legal sources and that my analytical work was contributing to legitimate research rather than harmful activities. But the analytical challenges continued becoming more specifically targeted at Yorkshire residents, with increasing focus on gathering detailed intelligence about specific individuals' personal circumstances, business relationships, and private activities. Some challenges required analyzing people's financial situations based on their digital footprints. Others involved identifying personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited for various purposes, and a few focused on mapping family relationships and social connections that could be used to influence or manipulate specific individuals. I started recognizing that the research I was conducting involved some people I knew personally from around Leeds, including detailed analysis of their private communications, business activities, and personal relationships. The puzzle platform wasn't just collecting abstract information about Yorkshire residents, but was systematically profiling real people I encountered in my daily life, using my analytical skills to compile intelligence that could be used for manipulation, harassment, or exploitation. My competitive puzzle-solving hobby had been exploited to recruit me for conducting surveillance research on my own community, with the intellectual satisfaction of challenging analytical work being used to overcome ethical concerns about systematic invasion of privacy. I tried to investigate what was being done with the analytical research I'd been conducting, following the specialized software connections to discover where my intelligence reports were being distributed and used. The investigation led to online communities that operated outside normal internet infrastructure, where detailed personal information about UK residents was being traded and analyzed for various purposes that range from targeted advertising to systematic harassment. The analytical intelligence I'd been providing through puzzle challenges was being used by these communities to develop comprehensive profiles of Yorkshire residents that could be used for financial exploitation, personal manipulation, or coordinated harassment campaigns. Some community participants specialized in using personal intelligence for systematic psychological manipulation of selected targets, while others focused on financial exploitation or identity theft based on detailed knowledge of people's circumstances and vulnerabilities. The research skills I developed through historical training and puzzle solving were being used to facilitate systematic harm to real people in my own community, with the intellectual challenge of analytical work being used to disguise surveillance activities as legitimate research. When I attempted to stop participating in the platform challenges, I discovered that my analytical work had already provided enough intelligence about Yorkshire residents to make withdrawal complicated, without risking exposure of activities I'd inadvertently supported. The platform made it clear that my research contributions had been valuable enough that they preferred continued cooperation, rather than dealing with complications that might arise if I attempted to expose their data collection activities. They suggested that ongoing participation in analytical challenges would be considerably less problematic than attempting to report activities that I'd already provided substantial research support for implementing. The competitive puzzle solving that had seemed like productive use of my analytical skills during unemployment had made me complicit in systematic surveillance activities affecting real people in my own community. I never found safe methods for extracting myself from involvement with the platform, or for warning Yorkshire residents who were being profiled using intelligence I'd helped compile through analytical challenges. The puzzle platform continues operating. The systematic analysis of UK residents continues expanding, and people continue having their personal information collected and distributed through gamified research challenges that exploit competitive instincts and intellectual curiosity. I eventually found teaching work through conventional job applications, but the analytical research I'd conducted during unemployment continues being used to facilitate systematic targeting of Yorkshire residents who have no idea their personal information was collected through puzzle-solving activities. The intellectual challenge that had seemed like productive use of my historical research skills turned out to be recruitment for comprehensive surveillance activities affecting real people in my own community, with competitive puzzle solving being used to overcome ethical resistance to systematic invasion of privacy. My analytical contributions continue being used to harm vulnerable individuals throughout Yorkshire, while the platform continues recruiting unemployed graduates who believe they're developing valuable research skills rather than providing intelligence for systematic exploitation disguised as challenging intellectual work. That's the thing about night shifts. They stretch on endlessly, especially when you're the only one there. 4 years working as a network security specialist for a mid-sized tech firm in London, and I still hadn't adjusted to the isolation. The office building near empty, just me and the occasional security guard making their rounds. The job itself wasn't difficult. Monitor systems, patch vulnerabilities, document any unusual traffic. By 2 a.m., I typically finished the actual work, leaving hours to fill before my shift ended. Most nights I'd read tech blogs or work on side projects. Sometimes I'd watch Netflix with the volume low, one eye on the security monitors. It was during one of these mind-numbing shifts that my life changed completely. Even now, I can't sleep properly. The doctor says it's stress-related insomnia, prescribes Zopiclone that does nothing but leave a metallic taste in my mouth. How could I tell him the real reason? That every time I close my eyes, I see what I saw that night, that I'm afraid of who I'm becoming. My colleague Jamie first mentioned the dark web to me during a shift change. He wasn't suggesting anything illegal, just talking about how fascinating it was from a technical perspective, the way people had created this entire shadow internet. Being in network security, I understood the mechanisms better than most, but I'd never actually explored it myself. Jamie described forums where people discussed everything from political dissidents to black market pharmaceuticals. He made it sound like an anthropological study, observing human behavior when anonymity was guaranteed. That night, I downloaded Tor, just to see what the fuss was about. The first few weeks, I just browsed, mostly mundane stuff, forums for people discussing drugs, some marketplaces selling counterfeit goods, political message boards. Nothing you couldn't find on the regular internet really, just with more paranoia and worse user interfaces. I was almost disappointed. Where was this digital underworld I'd heard about? Then I found a forum called Viewing Gallery. The description claimed it was for discussing real footage that the mainstream won't show you. I figured it was probably just conspiracy theorists sharing grainy UFO videos or something equally benign. I was wrong. The forum was divided into categories, each more disturbing than the last. War footage, industrial accidents, medical procedures gone wrong. Things I wished I could unsee, but found myself morbidly unable to look away from. One category was simply labeled rooms. I clicked it and found dozens of threads with cryptic titles like December Session Number 4 or Jakarta Special Viewing. The discussions beneath were vague but enthusiastic, with users thanking the hosts and requesting specific scenarios for future events. I didn't understand at first. Then I saw a comment. When's the next live show? Last one was cut short when subject expired too quickly. That's when I realized what I was looking at. Red rooms, supposedly live streams of torture or murder that viewers could watch or even direct. I'd always assumed they were an urban legend, something that conspiracy theorists and paranoid parents warned about, but that didn't actually exist. The technical challenges alone seemed insurmountable. How could you stream something like that securely without getting caught? I should have closed the browser. I should have walked away. Instead, I clicked on a pinned thread labeled verification process. The post explained that new viewers needed to be vetted before gaining access to live streams. There was a complicated process involving cryptocurrency payments and identity verification. Not your real identity, of course, but proof that you were a consistent persona and not law enforcement. I told myself I was just curious about the technical aspects. How were they maintaining security? What kind of streaming setup could handle this without being traceable? Professional curiosity. That's what I called it, as I created a dedicated persona and began the verification process. It took 3 weeks. Bitcoin transfers to anonymous wallets. Answers to increasingly disturbing hypothetical questions. References from existing members. I found someone willing to vouch for me in exchange for helping them with some network security issues. Each step giving me plenty of opportunities to back out, to realize what I was doing. But by then, I was too invested. I kept telling myself I would just look once, to confirm whether these rooms were real, and then I'd report everything to the National Crime Agency. The first live stream I gained access to was scheduled for 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I requested the night shift at work, knowing I'd be alone with secure internet access. As the designated time approached, a private message appeared with a one-time link. The message included instructions. No recording software, no screenshots, viewing limited to 45 minutes. I clicked the link. The video quality wasn't great, deliberately degraded, I assumed, to hide identifying details. The room was sparse. Concrete floor, white walls, a drain in the center, bright, clinical lighting, a metal table with restraints. It looked almost like a film set, too clean and deliberate to be real. A figure entered the frame wearing a plain mask that covered their entire head. They moved with casual confidence, adjusting the camera slightly before stepping away. Text appeared in a chat window beside the video. Welcome to tonight's viewing. 14 participants confirmed. Subject will arrive momentarily. Standard rules apply. My heart was pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be staged, some kind of extreme performance art or a very convincing simulation. Then the subject was brought in. I won't describe that person in detail. I can't. Even now, months later, I can barely bring myself to acknowledge what I saw, what I watched, what I didn't stop. The host addressed the camera occasionally, responding to requests in the chat. I didn't type anything. I couldn't move. I just stared, telling myself this elaborate hoax would reveal itself any moment. It never did. 27 minutes in, I closed the browser and vomited into my bin. I deleted Tor, ran security scrubs on my computer, and spent the rest of my shift shaking in my chair. I told myself I would report it in the morning. I would find a way to anonymously tip off the NCA or Interpol, someone who could trace the stream and stop these people. I didn't, because I wasn't sure I could report it without implicating myself, because a small, terrible part of me wasn't completely convinced it was real, because most shamefully, I was afraid. 2 days later, I received an email to my personal account, the one not connected to my dark web activities. It contained a single line. Did you enjoy the show? Your attendance was noted. I changed my email, my mobile number, eventually my flat. I found a new job across the country. I tell myself they were just trying to scare me, that they can't really track me to my real identity. But sometimes my new laptop camera, light turns on by itself, just for a few seconds before going dark again. My IT knowledge tells me it's probably just a software glitch. My nightmares tell me something else. I know they're watching me now. I've become the subject in a different kind of room. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear breathing on the other end of my phone line. Or I'll catch a glimpse of someone with a familiar way of moving, standing too still at the edge of a crowd. I've installed security cameras, extra locks, a VPN. I sleep with a cricket bat beside my bed. None of it helps, because I know what I did. I know what I saw and didn't stop. I know what's out there now, hiding in plain sight behind proxy servers and encrypted connections. Here's the thing about the dark web that no one tells you. Once you've really seen it, it never stops seeing you. I've written this as a warning, though I doubt it will make a difference. Curiosity is too powerful. That's why those rooms exist in the first place, because there will always be people who want to see. who need to witness the worst things humans can do to each other. I understand now that the viewers are as much a part of those rooms as the people wearing masks. Last week, I received a small package at my new address, the one no one is supposed to know. Inside was a plain white mask and a note with an IP address, an invitation. They're offering me a different seat this time, a promotion of sorts. I threw the mask away, burned the note, but I know the choice isn't really gone. It sits with me in my flat each night as I check and recheck the logs. It follows me to work, to Tesco, everywhere I go. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the tiny voice in the back of my mind, the one that wonders what it would be like on the other side of the camera. The voice that's been there all along, perhaps, just waiting for permission to speak. I've started locking my kitchen knives in a safe. I catch myself researching remote locations, properties with cellars, soundproofing materials. I close the browser each time, horrified at myself, but the searches become more frequent, more detailed. When my neighbor played his music too loudly last week, I found myself thinking not about asking him to turn it down, but about how no one would hear anything from his flat if the music was always that loud. I stood outside his door for 30 minutes before walking away, trembling and sick with myself. I don't know if what I saw that night changed me or revealed something that was always there. I don't know if I'm being hunted or recruited or both. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know, to understand what these places do to a person. The forums call it the viewer effect. The theory is that watching changes your brain chemistry permanently. I think it's simpler than that. I think watching makes you complicit. It makes you one of them. And once you're one of them, there's no going back to who you were before. Yesterday, I found myself in Curry's examining camera equipment, high-definition models with excellent low-light performance. The shop assistant asked what I was planning to film. I didn't have an answer. I left without buying anything, but I know I'll go back, or find another shop, or order online using one of the anonymous payment methods I learned about. The mask I threw away. Sometimes I think I see it out of the corner of my eye, sitting on my bedside table or kitchen worktop. When I look directly, it's gone, but I know it's here, waiting. Just like I know that someday, maybe soon, I'll try it on. I keep telling myself I can resist this pull towards something monstrous, that I am still essentially good, essentially human. But late at night, when my laptop screen glows in the darkness of my bedroom, I'm less certain. If you're reading this, perhaps you felt that same curiosity. Perhaps you're considering taking that first step, downloading Tor, finding those forums just to see, just to know. Don't. Or if you do, know that you're not just looking into an abyss. You're opening a door that swings both ways, and what comes through might be wearing your face. My mobile is buzzing now with a text from a number I don't recognize. It's an address, somewhere local, and a time. Tonight, I won't go. I can't go. But I haven't deleted the message, and I know exactly how long it would take me to get there on the tube. I've been trying to pinpoint exactly when I crossed the line from doing something questionable into doing something genuinely harmful. But the truth is, there probably wasn't one single moment. It was gradual. It was a series of small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time, but added up to something I'm deeply ashamed of now. I used to write recommendation letters for people applying to jobs. Sounds innocent enough, right? Except I was writing them for strangers I'd never met, people who paid me to fabricate glowing references for positions they weren't qualified for. I'm holed up in a Premier Inn outside Newcastle now, having fled my flat in Leeds after discovering what some of those recommendations were actually being used for, because it turns out that helping unqualified people get jobs they shouldn't have isn't just unethical, it's dangerous. And I've spent the last 6 months living with the consequences of not asking enough questions about who I was helping and why they needed my services. The whole thing started about 18 months ago, when I was barely scraping by as a freelance copywriter. I'd left my job as a communications officer for a local charity after a falling out with management, and I'd discovered that freelance writing paid even worse than I'd feared. Most months I was choosing between heating and eating, as the saying goes. I'd been doing the usual freelance work, blog posts, website copy, the occasional press release, when I came across a request on a freelance platform from someone looking for professional reference letters. They explained they were applying for jobs, but had been out of work for several years and didn't have recent references from employers who could vouch for their skills. The rate they offered was generous, £200 for a single letter that would take me perhaps an hour to write. They provided details about their work history and the type of position they were applying for, and I crafted a convincing reference letter supposedly from their previous manager. I felt uncomfortable about the deception, but I rationalized it by telling myself that everyone exaggerates on job applications, and I was just helping someone get their foot in the door. They probably had the skills they claimed, just not the documentation to prove it. The client was pleased with my work and recommended me to others who needed similar services. Within a few weeks, I was writing multiple reference letters each month, all for people who claimed to have employment gaps or difficult previous employers who wouldn't provide fair references. The money was keeping me afloat financially, and I convinced myself I was providing a legitimate service for people who'd been unfairly disadvantaged by circumstances beyond their control. After all, the job market was brutal, and sometimes good people needed a helping hand to compete with candidates who had more conventional career paths. But the requests started becoming more specific and troubling. Instead of general employment references, clients began asking for letters vouching for professional qualifications they clearly didn't possess. Teaching credentials, medical certifications, even security clearances for positions that required background checks. When I questioned whether I should be fabricating credentials for regulated professions, the clients assured me they had the necessary qualifications, but had lost their documentation or had problems with previous employers who were blocking their access to official records. The explanations were always plausible enough that I could convince myself I was helping victims of bureaucratic incompetence rather than enabling fraud. The rates increased as the requests became more demanding. I was soon earning more from writing fraudulent references than I had from my previous legitimate employment. The financial security was intoxicating after months of struggling to make rent. I developed a system for creating convincing reference letters that would pass casual scrutiny. I researched real companies and institutions, created plausible employment histories, even generated fake contact details that would redirect to voicemail boxes if anyone tried to verify the references. The work became almost routine. I'd receive a request with employment details, craft a convincing reference letter, and collect my fee. I stopped thinking about the consequences of what I was doing, treating it as just another writing assignment, rather than systematic fraud that was helping unqualified people access positions they had no business occupying. The breakthrough came when I saw a news report about a care home scandal in Yorkshire. Several elderly residents had died after receiving improper medication from a care worker who'd falsified her nursing credentials. The investigation revealed she'd been working in healthcare for over a year using fraudulent reference letters and fake certification documents. Something about the story felt familiar, and I checked my records to see if I'd ever written references for anyone in the healthcare sector. What I found made me feel physically sick. I'd written multiple reference letters for someone matching the care worker's description, fabricating employment history as a qualified nurse with years of experience in elderly care. I couldn't be certain it was the same person. My clients used pseudonyms and paid through anonymous channels, but the timing and details matched too closely to be coincidence. I'd probably helped an unqualified person get a job in a care home, where her incompetence had contributed to several deaths. The realization that my fraudulent reference letters might have enabled someone to kill vulnerable people, even unintentionally, was devastating. But what made it worse was understanding that this probably wasn't an isolated case. I'd written hundreds of reference letters over the past year, and I had no idea what positions those letters had helped people obtain, or what damage those unqualified individuals might have caused. I started researching my previous clients more carefully, trying to understand who I'd been helping and what positions they'd been applying for. What I discovered was far worse than I'd imagined. Many of my clients weren't just people with employment gaps or difficult previous employers. They were individuals who'd been barred from certain professions due to criminal convictions, incompetence, or professional misconduct. They were using my fraudulent references to circumvent the safeguards designed to protect vulnerable people from dangerous or incompetent workers. I found cases of people I'd helped get positions working with children, despite having convictions for child abuse. Others had accessed jobs in healthcare despite having been struck off professional registers for gross negligence. Some had even obtained security positions despite criminal backgrounds that should have disqualified them from such roles. The fraudulent references I'd been writing weren't just helping people exaggerate their qualifications. They were actively undermining the systems designed to protect vulnerable people from those who posed a danger to them. But what really disturbed me was discovering how my services were being advertised and shared. Using the same hidden internet channels where my clients had found me, I saw advertisements for reference writing services that explicitly targeted people who'd been banned from certain professions. The advertisements explained how my fraudulent references could help people circumvent background checks, access positions they were legally prohibited from holding, even target specific vulnerable populations like children or elderly people for exploitation. I realized I'd been part of an operation that systematically enabled dangerous people to access positions of trust and authority over vulnerable individuals. My writing skills were being weaponized to destroy the safeguards that protected those who needed protection most. Some of the discussion threads were horrifyingly explicit about why people needed fraudulent references. They talked about accessing care homes to exploit elderly residents, getting jobs in schools to target children, even obtaining positions in prisons or secure facilities to facilitate criminal activities. One thread discussed using fraudulent references to get hired at a women's refuge, with the explicit goal of gaining access to vulnerable domestic abuse victims. Another focused on targeting disability care services to exploit people who couldn't easily report abuse or defend themselves. I was looking at a systematic effort to place dangerous people in positions where they could harm the most vulnerable members of society, and I'd been helping them do it, writing convincing reference letters that enabled them to bypass the safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. The guilt became overwhelming when I found a case that was definitely connected to my work. A man I'd written references for had been arrested for abuse while working at a residential facility for adults with learning disabilities. The investigation revealed he'd been barred from working in care services years earlier, but had used fraudulent references to obtain his current position. I recognized the specific employment history I'd fabricated for him. the fictional manager whose glowing recommendation I'd created, even some of the phrasing I'd used to describe his supposed experience and qualifications. There was no doubt I'd enabled this man to access vulnerable people he'd previously been prevented from harming. The news reports detailed the abuse he'd inflicted on residents who trusted him, who'd been placed in his care by families who believed the facility had properly vetted its staff. People had suffered because I'd been willing to write fraudulent references without asking enough questions about why someone needed my services. I tried to contact the authorities to report what I'd been doing and provide information about the fraudulent reference operation, but explaining my role without incriminating myself proved impossible. I'd been knowingly committing fraud for over a year, helping dangerous people circumvent safeguards, and I had no legal protection for coming forward. The police officer I spoke to was sympathetic but frank about the consequences I'd face if I provided evidence of my activities. I'd committed serious crimes that had enabled harm to vulnerable people, and cooperation wouldn't necessarily protect me from prosecution. I was advised to consult with a solicitor before providing any detailed information, but I couldn't afford legal representation on my meager freelance income. I was trapped between my guilt about what I'd enabled and my fear of facing criminal prosecution for my role in the fraud. That's when I decided to stop writing fraudulent references entirely and try to distance myself from the whole operation. I deleted all my client records, closed down my accounts on the freelance platforms, even destroyed my computer hard drive to eliminate evidence of what I'd been doing. But it was already too late to erase my involvement. The reference letters I'd written were still being used by dangerous people to access vulnerable populations. The damage I'd helped cause would continue long after I'd stopped enabling it. I started receiving messages from former clients asking why I was no longer available for reference writing services. Some were polite inquiries, but others had a threatening tone that made it clear they weren't happy about losing access to my services. One message in particular frightened me. A former client explained that they'd been relying on my references to maintain employment in their current position, and if I wasn't available to provide updated references for future applications, they might need to share information about my fraudulent activities with the authorities. I realized I was being blackmailed by someone I'd helped commit fraud. They were threatening to expose my illegal activities if I didn't continue enabling their deception, and there was nothing I could do about it without admitting my own complicity in systematic fraud. The threats escalated when I refused to resume writing references. Former clients began posting details about my real identity and location on the hidden internet channels where they'd originally found my services. They were exposing me to others who might be interested in preventing me from cooperating with authorities or revealing information about the fraud operation. I started noticing signs that I was being watched. People photographing me from across the street, cars following me around Leeds, even evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out. The people I'd been helping had decided I was now a liability they needed to monitor and control. The final straw came when I received an envelope containing photographs of me going about my daily routine, along with a list of the vulnerable people who'd been harmed by individuals I'd provided references for. The message was clear. If I caused problems by going to the authorities, information about my role in enabling those harms would be shared widely. I realized I was being held hostage by my own guilt and complicity. The people I'd helped were using my knowledge of what I'd done to ensure I couldn't expose their ongoing activities without destroying my own life in the process. That's when I decided to leave Leeds entirely. I withdrew what little money I had in my bank account, packed essential belongings, and drove to Newcastle, where I hoped I could disappear for a while. I've been staying in budget hotels, moving every few days, trying to avoid establishing any pattern that might make me easy to find. But I know running away doesn't solve anything. The reference letters I wrote are still being used by dangerous people to access vulnerable populations. The safeguards I helped circumvent are still failing to protect those who need protection most. And the guilt I feel about my role in enabling harm to innocent people only grows heavier with each passing day. I keep thinking about the elderly people who died in that care home, the residents who were abused in the disability facility, all the other victims whose suffering was enabled by reference letters I wrote for a few £100s. They trusted that the people caring for them had been properly vetted, that the system had protected them from those who meant them harm. But I helped destroy that trust, helped dangerous people infiltrate the very institutions designed to protect vulnerable individuals. And I did it knowingly, consciously choosing to ignore the obvious warning signs because I needed money more than I cared about the potential consequences. The fraudulent reference operation continues without me. Other writers are probably being recruited to provide the same services I did, creating convincing documentation for people who've been barred from certain professions for good reason. The hidden internet channels where these services are advertised are still active, still connecting dangerous people with writers willing to help them circumvent safeguards. The systematic infiltration of care services, schools, and other institutions continues, enabled by people like me who value their financial security more than the safety of vulnerable people. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone to the authorities immediately, despite the legal consequences I'd face. Whether preventing future harm would have been worth accepting punishment for the fraud I'd committed. But fear of prosecution and shame about what I'd done kept me silent until it was too late to prevent the worst consequences of my actions. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand how easy it is to become complicit in terrible things when you're desperate for money, how the desire to pay rent and eat regularly can override your moral judgment until you're actively enabling harm to innocent people. And because I want you to understand that every time you trust an institution to protect vulnerable people, that trust depends on systems working properly and people acting ethically. But those systems can be circumvented by anyone with a few £100s and a willingness to hire someone like me who prioritizes their own financial security over the safety of others. The worst part is knowing that I can't undo the damage I helped cause. Can't protect the vulnerable people who are still being targeted by individuals I helped infiltrate care services and other trusted institutions. All I can do is hide in anonymous hotels and hope that eventually the guilt becomes bearable enough that I can sleep without seeing the faces of victims I never met, but helped harm nonetheless. I keep hoping someone with more courage than I have will expose these fraudulent reference operations before they enable more harm. But I'm not optimistic about that happening, because the people who profit from circumventing safeguards understand how to exploit desperate writers like me, how to insulate themselves from consequences, and how to ensure that their victims remain silent through fear and complicity. And in the meantime, vulnerable people continue to suffer because I was willing to write convincing lies for anyone who could pay my rate, without asking enough questions about why they needed my services or what they planned to do with the fraudulent credentials I provided. I deleted everything 3 weeks ago, wiped my laptop, threw away my external drives, even got rid of my phone and bought a new one. People think digital footprints are permanent, but you'd be surprised how thoroughly you can erase yourself if you're motivated enough. And I was very, very motivated. The thing is, I know it won't matter. They already have what they need. But doing something, anything, made me feel slightly less powerless, slightly less complicit in what happened. I should probably explain what I mean by that, what I did, what I saw. I'm a freelance photographer, or haven't picked up my camera in months now. I used to do wedding photography mainly, the occasional corporate event, sometimes product shoots for small businesses trying to look more professional than they actually were. It paid the bills, barely, and I was good at it. Had that ability to make people look natural even when they were deeply uncomfortable, which is apparently a valuable skill when you're photographing someone's awkward second cousin at a wedding reception in Nottingham. The work dried up during the lockdowns, obviously. Weddings postponed indefinitely. Businesses closing. Nobody wanting a photographer within 2 meters of them. I burned through my savings in about 4 months, then started living on credit cards, then started getting very creative about what constituted an essential expense. By the time things started opening up again, I was in debt up to my eyeballs and absolutely desperate for work. But the photography industry had changed. Everyone with a decent phone camera suddenly thought they were professionals. Prices had collapsed. The jobs I used to get offered for 400 or 500 quid were now going for 100, sometimes less. I was applying for everything, undercutting my own rates, and still barely getting responses. That's when I started looking for alternative income. Not because I wanted to do anything illegal or dodgy. I just needed money, and I needed it quickly. I'd heard about people selling stock photography online, licensing images to websites and publications. It seemed simple enough. Take some decent photographs, upload them to stock sites, earn a few quid every time someone downloaded them. The problem was that stock photography is incredibly oversaturated. Millions of images of people having breakfast or shaking hands in offices or staring pensively at sunsets. My photos were fine, perfectly competent, but they disappeared into the noise. I made maybe £30 in 2 months. Then I stumbled across a discussion thread. This was on the regular internet, nothing dark or hidden, where photographers were talking about niche markets. Apparently, there was decent money in very specific types of stock imagery that mainstream sites didn't cater to. Medical photos, industrial photography, that sort of thing. One person mentioned that the real money was in custom requests, if you knew where to find them. Someone in the replies mentioned the dark web, said there were communities there that paid significantly better for specific types of photography. No questions asked. I'd heard about the dark web before, obviously, but only in that vague way everyone has. Drugs and hitmen and stolen credit cards. The idea of it being a marketplace for legitimate services hadn't really occurred to me. I was skeptical at first, but I was also eviction notice desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Getting access wasn't particularly complicated. Took me an evening of following guides and figuring out how to browse anonymously. And then I was there, looking at websites that resembled something from the late 90s, all text and minimal formatting. I spent a few days just exploring, trying to understand how it all worked. There were marketplaces, sure, selling exactly the kinds of things you'd expect, but there were also service listings. People offering skills ranging from graphic design to translation to consultation. And there were photography requests. Most of them were straightforward. Someone wanted photos of a specific building in Birmingham from multiple angles, probably for something architectural or planning related. Someone else wanted candid street photography from Manchester city centre during specific times of day. The pay was decent, much better than stock photography, and payment was arranged through methods I won't detail here, but which seemed secure enough. I started taking those jobs. Nothing sinister, nothing that made me uncomfortable. Just photography with specific requirements, delivered anonymously, paid reasonably well. It kept me afloat, paid down some of my debt, let me breathe a bit easier. The request got more specific over time. Someone wanted photographs of a particular house in Leeds, exterior shots only, taken at different times of day across a week. Someone else wanted images of the interior of a specific pub in Newcastle, as detailed as possible. I told myself these were probably for property assessments or business valuations, things that needed to be done anonymously for whatever reason. I never asked questions. That was the unspoken rule. You fulfilled the request exactly as specified, delivered the images, got paid, moved on. No communication beyond the initial brief. Then I got a request that paid significantly more than anything I'd seen before. Almost £3,000 for what seemed like a simple job. Someone wanted photographs of a specific flat in Bristol. Interior shots as comprehensive as possible. Every room, every angle. They'd provide access. There'd be a key hidden near the property, and I'd have a 2-hour window when the flat would definitely be empty. £3,000. That was 2 months of rent, a massive chunk off my credit cards, breathing room I desperately needed. I should have questioned why someone would pay that much. Should have wondered why they couldn't just hire a normal photographer through normal channels. Should have asked myself what possible legitimate reasons someone would have for wanting detailed photographs of someone else's flat without their knowledge. But I didn't. I just accepted the job. The flat was in a converted Victorian house in Clifton, the nice part of Bristol. The key was exactly where they said it would be, tucked behind a loose brick near the entrance. The flat itself was on the 2nd floor. I let myself in during the specified window, a Tuesday afternoon, middle of the day, when presumably the occupant was at work. It was a woman's flat clearly, neat but lived in, books on the shelves, photos on the walls, the kind of space that felt like someone actually inhabited it, rather than just existed there. I felt sick doing it, moving through her private space with my camera. But I told myself I was just taking photos, not stealing anything, not damaging anything, just photographs. I shot everything as requested, the living room from multiple angles, the kitchen, including inside the cupboards and fridge as specified, the bathroom, the bedroom, which felt like the worst violation somehow, photographing someone's unmade bed and the clothes draped over a chair and the books on their nightstand. There were photos of her throughout the flat, with friends, with family, on holiday. She looked happy in them, normal, completely unaware that a stranger would soon be standing in her bedroom, documenting every detail of her private life. I finished the job, locked up, replaced the key, uploaded the photographs through the secure method they'd specified. The payment came through within hours. I tried not to think about it, tried to tell myself it was probably for insurance purposes or some kind of property dispute, but I knew that was rubbish. Nobody pays £3,000 for insurance photos. Nobody needs that level of detail, that invasion of privacy, for any legitimate purpose. I knew what those photos were probably for. Either someone planning to rob her, or someone obsessed with her, or something worse I didn't want to imagine. And I'd helped them. I'd provided the tools for whatever was going to happen. But I'd also been paid £3,000, and my landlord had stopped sending threatening letters, and I could buy food without calculating the cost of every item. So I took the money and tried to forget about it. A week later, I got another request. Same type of job, different location. A house in Southampton this time. £4,000. Again, access would be provided. Specific time window. Comprehensive interior photography required. I told myself I wouldn't do it. Told myself the Bristol job had been a one-off moment of desperation, and I was better than this. But £4,000. Christ, I did the job. And then I did another one. And another. Over about 3 months, I photographed the interiors of maybe a dozen properties across England. Houses, flats, even a few businesses. Always the same pattern. Generous payment provided access, specific window of time, detailed photography required. The money was extraordinary. I cleared my debts completely, built up savings, could have stopped doing it at any time, but I didn't stop. That's the thing I'm most ashamed of. It wasn't desperation anymore. It was just greed. Easy money for a few hours of work. I'd gotten good at not thinking about what the photos might be used for, at compartmentalizing the ethics of it. Then came the request that changed everything. It was for a flat in Reading. The pay was higher than usual, almost £6,000. The brief was similar to previous jobs. Comprehensive interior photography during a specified time window. But this one included an additional file, a photograph of the occupant, presumably so I'd know whose flat I was documenting. I shouldn't have opened that file. Should have just declined the job right there. But I clicked it. The photograph showed a young woman, mid-20s probably, dark hair, sitting in what looked like a cafe. She was looking at her phone, unaware she was being photographed. There was something about the image that made my skin crawl. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, through a window. This wasn't a social media photo or a casual snapshot. This was surveillance. Below the image was a single line of text. Usual requirements plus any personal items of interest. Personal items of interest. What the hell did that mean? Diaries, computers, underwear. I stared at that request for hours. This wasn't about property valuation or insurance. This was about a woman who was being watched, being targeted, by someone who was now asking me to help them get closer to her, to provide an intimate map of her private life. I should have refused, should have deleted everything and never gone back to that site. But £6,000, I hate myself for what I did next. I hate that I can't even claim it was desperation or stupidity. It was just pure, calculating greed. I accepted the job. The flat was in a modern building near the town centre. Nice area, secure entrance, the kind of place where you'd feel safe. The key was hidden as usual, the time window specified. 2 hours during a Thursday afternoon. I let myself in and immediately knew something was different. The flat felt lived in a way the others hadn't. There were plants on the windowsill, properly cared for, fresh flowers in a vase, a calendar on the wall with neat handwriting marking various appointments. This wasn't just someone's space, it was someone's carefully maintained life. I started with the main rooms as usual. Living room, kitchen, bathroom. Standard shots from multiple angles. But I kept noticing details that made me increasingly uncomfortable. A medical alert bracelet on the bedside table. Prescription medication in the bathroom cabinet. A walking stick leaning against the wall near the door. This woman was vulnerable somehow, and someone was paying me £6,000 to document every aspect of her private space. I should have stopped. Should have walked out right then. But I was already there, already inside, already complicit. So I kept going. The bedroom was worse than the others had been. More personal somehow. There were photos everywhere. Family photos, friend photos, holiday photos. A whole life documented on the walls. I photographed them all as requested, hating myself more with every click of the shutter. Then I found the laptop on her desk. It was closed, probably in sleep mode. The request had mentioned personal items of interest. Did they want me to open it, go through her files? I stood there for a long time, trying to decide. Part of me knew that opening that laptop would cross a line I couldn't uncross. The photography was bad enough, but this felt like something darker. In the end, I didn't open it. I just photographed it, photographed the desk around it, moved on. I finished the job quickly after that, desperate to be out of there. Locked up, replaced the key, went home feeling filthy in a way that had nothing to do with physical dirt. I uploaded the photographs that night and waited for payment. It came through within a few hours, same as always. £6,000 appearing in my account like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just violated a stranger's privacy in the most intimate way possible. I tried to forget about it, tried to go back to normal life, normal photography work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that flat in Reading, about the woman in the photograph, going about her life, completely unaware that someone had been inside her home, documenting everything. 3 weeks later, I saw a news article. A woman in Reading had been attacked in her own flat by an intruder. He'd somehow gained access to the building, let himself into her flat with a key, waited for her to come home. She'd survived, but was in hospital with serious injuries. The police were appealing for information. The article included a photograph of the victim. I recognized her immediately. The same dark hair, the same face I'd seen in that surveillance photo. I felt physically sick, actually had to run to the bathroom and throw up, because I'd helped that happen. Maybe the person who'd attacked her was the same person who'd hired me. Maybe it was someone they'd sold the information to. Maybe it was even more removed than that. But the chain of cause and effect was clear. My photographs had helped someone hurt that woman. I stopped taking those jobs immediately, stopped going on the dark web at all. But the damage was done. I'd enabled something terrible, and there was nothing I could do to take it back. I reported it to the police eventually. Anonymous tip, no personal details. Told them about the photography requests, the dark web marketplace, everything I knew. I don't know if they took it seriously, or if they could even do anything with that information. The dark web isn't easy to investigate, and I couldn't provide much in the way of useful details. The woman survived, I found out later. The man who attacked her was arrested a few weeks after, caught trying to do the same thing to someone else. He had photographs on his computer, detailed interior shots of multiple properties. Some of them were mine. I recognized my own work. Other photographers had been doing the same jobs I had, helping him prepare, providing reconnaissance. We weren't the ones who hurt those women, but we'd built the ladder someone else climbed. I still think about those flats sometimes, about the people whose homes I violated, whose private lives I documented and sold. I wonder if they ever found out, if they ever felt that creeping sense that someone had been in their space, touching their things, learning their secrets. I wonder if the woman in Reading ever feels safe in her own home now, if she looks at her possessions differently, knowing that someone photographed them, studied them, used that knowledge to hurt her. I've got money saved now, enough to live on for a while without working. But every time I look at that bank balance, I see those flats, those private spaces I shouldn't have been in. That woman's face in the news article, blood money, that's what they used to call it, isn't it? Money earned through harm. I thought I was just taking photographs, thought I could separate the action from the consequence, tell myself I was just providing a service and what happened after wasn't my responsibility. But it was. It is. I helped hurt people because I wanted money, and no amount of rationalizing changes that. The worst part is how easy it was, how quickly I went from desperate to greedy, from one questionable job to a dozen, from feeling sick about it to barely thinking about it at all. That's what frightens me most. Not what I did, but how simple it was to do. How easy it is to become complicit in terrible things when you're just trying to get by. I've thought about going to therapy, talking to someone about what happened. But what would I even say? that I'm traumatized by my own choices, that I'm struggling with guilt over something I did willingly, repeatedly for months. I don't deserve sympathy. The woman in Reading does. The other people whose homes I violated do. I just deserve to live with what I've done. So I deleted everything, like I said at the start. Wiped it all clean. But you can't wipe your memory. Can't delete the knowledge of what you're capable of when circumstances push you in the wrong direction. I see that woman's face sometimes when I close my eyes. The one from the surveillance photo, sitting in that cafe, looking at her phone, completely unaware that her life was about to be invaded. Completely unaware that somewhere out there was a photographer desperate enough and greedy enough to help make that invasion possible. That photographer was me. I did that, and I'll carry that knowledge for the rest of my life. I started working from home last January. The transition wasn't difficult. My job as a data analyst for a health insurance company translated well to remote work. Just me, my laptop, and endless spreadsheets tracking claim patterns and cost projections. The company sent us home with monitors, docking stations, and even ergonomic chairs. They wanted to make sure our productivity wouldn't suffer during the isolation. My apartment wasn't ideal for a home office. One bedroom, thin walls, and neighbors who seemed determined to renovate during business hours. I converted half my living room into a workspace, setting up near the window for natural light. The arrangement worked well enough for the first few months. My internet connection was reliable, my work routine established, my performance reviews positive. In April, I started having connection issues. Video calls would freeze, downloads would stall. Websites that had loaded instantly now took ages to appear. At first, I blamed my service provider. They were notorious for throttling speeds during peak hours. But after several technician visits and modem replacements, the problems persisted. Strangely, the issues seemed most pronounced between midnight and 4 a.m., when I wasn't even using the internet. I started monitoring my network traffic using software recommended by our IT department. The data showed massive bandwidth consumption during those early morning hours, despite all my devices supposedly being in sleep mode. Something was using my connection and using it heavily. My first thought was a neighbor had somehow accessed my network. I changed my Wi-Fi password, enabled additional security features, and installed a VPN. The mysterious usage continued. Next, I suspected malware. Perhaps my laptop had been compromised and was part of some botnet. I ran every scanning tool available, finding nothing unusual. The IT team remotely inspected my work laptop and pronounced it clean. The mystery bothered me enough that I began staying up late, watching the network monitor in real time, trying to identify which device was responsible. My sleep suffered. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My work performance began to decline. Colleagues commented on my appearance during video calls. I started keeping the camera off. One night in May, around 1 a.m., I caught it happening. The network monitor showed active data transfer, nearly maxing out my bandwidth. The source was a device listed only as media server, something I didn't recognize and certainly hadn't set up. I immediately logged into my router's admin panel to block the device, but when I refreshed the connected devices list, media server had disappeared. The next day, I contacted my building's management company about the internet issues. The maintenance supervisor suggested I might be picking up interference from other apartments and recommended positioning my router away from shared walls. When I mentioned the mysterious device, he seemed uninterested, attributing it to a neighbor's smart TV or gaming system. briefly connecting to the wrong network. That explanation didn't satisfy me. I ordered a new router with advanced security features, setting it up to log all connection attempts and data usage by device. That night, I stayed up again, watching the logs in real time. At precisely 1:17 a.m., Media Server appeared again, beginning its huge data transfers. This time, I managed to capture its MAC address before it disappeared, a unique identifier that should help track down the physical device. The next morning, I contacted a friend who works in cybersecurity. He couldn't identify the manufacturer from the MAC address. It seemed to be using a randomized identifier that changed with each connection. This was sophisticated behavior, not typical of consumer electronics accidentally connecting to the wrong network. When I shared the timing pattern and bandwidth usage, he grew concerned. The behavior matched what he called data mules, compromised networks used to transmit large encrypted files during low traffic hours. My friend warned me that my network might be being used for transferring illegal content, anything from stolen financial data to more disturbing materials. He recommended I contact my internet service provider and possibly law enforcement. The thought that my connection might be facilitating something illegal made me deeply uncomfortable. Before taking that step, I decided to gather more information. I set up additional monitoring software that could track not just the amount of data, but also attempt to identify the type of traffic and its destination. The results were puzzling. The data wasn't being sent to multiple destinations as would be expected with botnet activity. Instead, it was a sustained connection to a single endpoint, using encrypted protocols that masked the content. The destination IP address changed nightly, but always pointed to servers using Tor exit nodes, the infrastructure of the so-called dark web. My friend confirmed this was consistent with someone using my network as a relay for accessing hidden services, potentially to mask their own identity. The question remained, who was doing this and how had they gained access? I became obsessed with finding answers. I started logging every electronic device in my apartment, not just computers and phones, but the smart TV, digital thermostat, even the refrigerator with its internet connectivity feature. None matched the mysterious Media Server MAC address. I checked for hidden devices, looking behind furniture, inside vents, examining the electrical outlets for suspicious adapters. Nothing. In June, after 6 weeks of disrupted sleep and growing anxiety, I made a breakthrough. The mystery device only connected when I was home. On nights I stayed at a friend's place or worked late at a coffee shop. My network log showed no unusual activity. The implication was unsettling. Whatever was happening was somehow tied to my presence. That night, I conducted an experiment. I left all my devices powered on as usual, but shut off the bedroom and bathroom lights, creating the impression I had gone to sleep. Then I sat in darkness near my router, a network analyzer running silently on my laptop. At 1:14 a.m., I heard a soft electronic tone from somewhere in my apartment, almost imperceptible, like the sound a device makes when powering on. 3 minutes later, Media Server appeared on my network. I tracked the signal strength, moving my laptop around the apartment to find where it was strongest. The source appeared to be my bedroom. I searched methodically, under the bed, in the closet, behind the dresser. Nothing. Then I noticed my work laptop, closed and apparently asleep on the nightstand. According to my monitoring software, it wasn't the source. But when I opened it, the screen remained dark while the power indicator showed it was running. I forced a shutdown and restarted it. Everything seemed normal. The company's security software showed no unauthorized access, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the machine. I decided to work exclusively on my personal laptop for a few days, leaving the work device powered off and stored in a drawer. The mysterious bandwidth usage stopped immediately. 3 nights with no media server appearing on my network. On the 4th day, I received an email from IT asking why my work laptop hadn't connected to the company servers for scheduled updates. I explained I was having technical issues and was using my personal device temporarily. They insisted I reconnect the work laptop as soon as possible for security compliance. Reluctantly, I took the laptop from the drawer and powered it on. Everything appeared normal. Same login screen, same desktop configuration, same applications. But that night, media server reappeared on my network at exactly 1:17 a.m. I was now convinced the work laptop contained something it shouldn't. I contacted IT again, more explicitly describing my concerns. They seemed dismissive, suggesting I was misinterpreting normal corporate security measures that run in the background. When I pressed further, mentioning the dark web connections, their tone changed. They said they would send a replacement laptop immediately and asked me to return my current one directly to their security team rather than through the normal equipment channels. The replacement arrived the next day via courier. The security team requested I not power on the old laptop again and pack it in the provided shielded bag. Their sudden urgency only heightened my suspicion. That night, with the old laptop unplugged and sealed in the shielded bag, my network remained quiet. No unusual connections, no bandwidth spikes. In July, a month after returning the laptop, I received a call from someone identifying themselves as part of the company's external security audit team. They asked detailed questions about my work habits, when I typically logged in, how often I used the company VPN, whether I ever observed unusual behavior from the laptop. They seemed particularly interested in whether I used the machine during off hours or if it remained powered on overnight. I answered honestly, then asked why they were investigating. The auditor explained they were conducting routine security checks on all remote workers. The explanation seemed reasonable, but something in their tone felt rehearsed. A week later, I was called into a virtual meeting with HR and my department head. They explained that due to restructuring, my position was being eliminated. They offered a generous severance package in exchange for signing a confidentiality agreement covering not just company data, but also any observations about company equipment or security practices. The implication was clear. Take the money, stay quiet, move on. I signed the agreement. The severance would cover my expenses while I looked for new work. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had been happening. What had been on that laptop? What kind of data was being transmitted through my network in those early morning hours? My cybersecurity friend suggested a theory. The laptop had been compromised, not by an outside threat, but by someone inside the company. Perhaps someone in IT or security was using employee devices as relays for accessing dark web services, counting on the company's VPN and security software to mask their activities. The fact that the usage occurred only when I was home suggested the laptop might have been monitoring my presence, perhaps through the microphone detecting ambient noise or the webcam sensing light changes, to determine when it was safe to activate. In August, I found a new job with a different company. Remote work again, but this time I established strict boundaries. No equipment stays powered on after hours. Nothing connects to my home network without thorough vetting. I invested in a network firewall that logs and blocks suspicious activities. I should have felt secure again. I didn't. Last week, I received an anonymous email. The subject line contained only a timestamp, 1:17 a.m. The body was empty. I deleted it immediately and ran security scans on all my devices. Nothing unusual was detected. 3 days ago, while reviewing my new home security system footage, I noticed something strange. At exactly 1:17 a.m., the camera in my home office briefly lost connection, just for a few seconds, but long enough to create a gap in the recording. The system logs showed no errors, no power fluctuations, no explanation for the interruption. Yesterday, I received a package. No return address, no shipping label, no indication of how it had arrived at my door. Inside was a laptop, not a brand I recognized, with no manufacturer markings of any kind. Just a plain black case with a power button that emitted a soft blue glow. I haven't opened it, haven't connected it to power. It sits in my closet now, inside 3 layers of signal blocking material. I haven't told anyone about the package, haven't reported it to the police. Something tells me it wouldn't make a difference. Something tells me this isn't about me specifically. I'm just a node in a network, a convenient relay point for information traveling between unseen parties. Sometimes at night, I wake suddenly at 1:16 a.m., 1 minute before whatever this is activates. I lie in bed, listening to the silence of my apartment, waiting for that soft electronic tone I heard months ago. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. Sometimes I convince myself it's just imagination. But the other night, I checked my network logs out of habit. At exactly 1:17 a.m. for precisely 3 minutes, an unknown device had connected to my network. The identifier was different this time. Not media server, but observer client. The data transfer was minimal, just a few kilobytes. Just enough to send a message. I'm still here. I'm still watching. I'm writing this now as a warning, though I'm not entirely sure what I'm warning against. Corporate espionage, government surveillance, organized criminal networks. The boundary between these possibilities seems increasingly blurred. All I know with certainty is that our digital lives are not as private as we imagine. Our networks not as secure as we're led to believe. Something moves through the infrastructure we've built, using our connections, our devices, our homes as waypoints in a journey we can't see or understand. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, it pauses briefly at your address before continuing on its way.